You can't see it, but if you look around you, you'll find that everywhere you look, there are people breathing. Listen closely. Can you hear it? This symphony of humanity is life as we know it. It's a constant reminder that we are alive. But what if this symphony was to suddenly stop? What would happen if the world lost oxygen for 5 seconds? Imagine for a moment the air around you, the very essence of what allows you to breathe, suddenly disappears. This isn't a scene from a science fiction movie. It's a reality we've all experienced, albeit not consciously. Every time you inhale and exhale, you're taking in and giving off the gas that makes life possible. But have you ever stopped to think about how precious this ability is? How fragile our existence truly is? This is the story of a world without air, a chilling tale of survival, desperation, and the lengths humans will go to stay alive. As we dive into this narrative, we want you to take a moment to reflect on your own life. How do you take your breath for granted? In the next 60 seconds, your life will change forever. And when you realize what's happening, it will be too late. In the bustling city, a sea of people are immersed in their daily routines, oblivious to the silent threat lurking in the air they breathe. Among them is Sarah, a young woman out for her morning run. She's vibrant and full of life, her lungs taking in the crisp morning air with each stride. Meanwhile, John, a busy businessman, is on his way to an important meeting. He walks with purpose, unaware of the danger that awaits him at his destination. Suddenly, amidst the chaos of city life, something inexplicable happens. The air, which has always been a constant presence, simply vanishes. There's no warning, no sign of what's to come. One moment the world is filled with the sounds of traffic and chatter, and in the next, there's an eerie silence. People freeze in their tracks, mouths open, eyes wide with disbelief. They try to speak, but no sound comes out. Panic begins to set in. In a desperate attempt to understand what's happening, Sarah and John reach out to loved ones, but their calls go unanswered. Cell phones, once lifelines to the outside world, now become useless bricks in their hands. The realization dawns on them that they are truly alone in this terrifying ordeal. The clock is ticking, and every second without air brings them closer to disaster. As the seconds turn into minutes, the situation becomes increasingly dire. People collapse, víctimas do desconhecido. The streets, once teeming with life, now resemble an apocalyptic scene straight out of a horror movie. Amidst this chaos, Sarah and John find themselves inexplicably drawn to each other. They form an unlikely alliance, two strangers united by fear and the desperate hope of survival. With each passing moment, the air grows thinner, making it harder to breathe. Their heartbeats pound in their chests, a frantic rhythm against the backdrop of silence. In their desperate struggle to survive, they stumble upon an abandoned subway tunnel. It's dark, dank, and seemingly devoid of hope. But in the absence of oxygen, they have little choice but to venture inside. With each step into the darkness, they're confronted with the harsh reality of their situation. The air pocket they had found provided only a temporary reprieve. Now they must navigate the suffocating darkness of the subway tunnels, hoping to find a way out before time runs out. As they descend deeper into the tunnels, they encounter others who have sought refuge there, all desperately clinging to life. Among them is a young couple, Tom and Lisa, who are frantically searching for their baby, left behind in the outside world. The three join forces, their individual struggles momentarily forgotten in the face of a common enemy, the absence of air. In this underground labyrinth, they come across a group of survivors huddled around a faint light source. At first, there's a sense of relief, a feeling that they're not alone in this ordeal. But this feeling is short-lived. The group is led by a man named David, who reveals that he has a plan to escape the tunnels. However, his proposal is met with skepticism. Trust is scarce, and the desperation of their situation hangs heavy in the air. With dwindling oxygen levels, they must make a crucial decision: trust David and his plan, or venture forth alone into the suffocating darkness. Their lives hang in the balance as they weigh their options, each path fraught with peril. As the seconds tick by, Sarah remembers a news report she had seen about an underground bunker built to withstand nuclear attacks. Could this be their salvation? A sanctuary where they could wait until the oxygen returns? With renewed hope, she suggests the idea to the group. However, the others are hesitant. The thought of venturing into the unknown is terrifying, especially with the constant threat of suffocation looming over them. John, driven by the desire to save his wife and child, decides to take matters into his own hands. He convinces the others to trust Sarah's idea, and together they embark on a perilous journey to find the bunker. A faint glimmer of hope ignites within them, propelling them forward in the face of certain death. The search for the bunker leads them through a labyrinth of tunnels, each turn presenting new challenges and testing their resolve. As they navigate the darkness, the weight of their dwindling oxygen supply presses down on them, a constant reminder of the ticking clock that is their survival. Finally, just when their hope is almost extinguished, they hear a faint sound, the distant hum of ventilation. With renewed energy, they stumble upon a heavy steel door, their hopes soaring. As they push it open, they are greeted by the sight of rows upon rows of bunk beds and shelves stocked with supplies. They have found the bunker. As they step inside, the airtight door shuts behind them, sealing their fate. With limited supplies and dwindling hope, they must now endure the unknown, waiting for the air to return, or perhaps more ominously, waiting for their time to run out. Inside the bunker, they settle in for what they believe will be a long wait. They ration the limited supplies, water and food becoming precious commodities. The silence is deafening, broken only by the sound of their own breathing and the distant hum of the bunker's life support system. Days turn into nights, and the survivors struggle to keep their spirits up. The oppressive darkness of the bunker takes a toll on their mental health, blurring the lines between reality and madness. The ticking clock of their survival serves as a constant reminder of the precarious nature of their existence. As their hope begins to dwindle, they are forced to confront the possibility that they may never see the sunlight again. The question that haunts them is whether they will die embracing the darkness, or will they fight to the very end to reclaim the air that sustains them? Amidst the despair, Sarah discovers a hidden stash of batteries and a generator. With newfound determination, she rallies the others, proposing that they use the bunker's electrical system to send a distress signal. However, her idea is met with skepticism. The task is daunting and the odds seem insurmountable. But with the promise of a potential rescue, they are compelled to try. Working together, they manage to get the generator running, its hum a beacon of hope in the oppressive silence. As they prepare to send their SOS signal, a sense of unity binds them. Despite their fears and uncertainties, they find solace in their shared purpose, their determination to survive. In the face of adversity, the survivors' resourcefulness knows no bounds. Using salvaged parts and their collective knowledge, they fashion makeshift tools to amplify their signal. Each creak and groan of the bunker adds to the tension as they wait for a response. The atmosphere inside the bunker shifts from despair to cautious optimism as they contemplate the possibility of rescue. But their hopes are soon dashed when days pass without a reply. The silence from the outside world is deafening, leaving them to wonder if anyone is out there looking for them. Just when their spirits are at their lowest, they hear the distant sound of sirens. Hope rekindled, they rush to the bunker door, their hearts pounding in their chests. The sirens grow louder, each sound a hammer blow to their fading hope. As they watch in suspense, they see a military convoy approaching the bunker. Relief washes over them, tears of joy streaming down their faces. Their ordeal is finally coming to an end. However, their joy is short-lived. The convoy stops, but instead of opening the bunker doors, soldiers clad in protective gear emerge. They quickly cordon off the area, transforming the scene into a tense standoff. The survivors, still weak and vulnerable, are forced to confront yet another challenge: the uncertainty of what lies beyond the bunker walls. As the soldiers approach the bunker, they maintain a non-threatening stance, their hands raised in a gesture of peace. But their expressions remain stoic, betraying no emotion. The survivors cautiously open the door, stepping out into the world they once knew. To their astonishment, they find themselves in a transformed world. The familiar streets are eerily deserted, devoid of any signs of life. A thick layer of dust covers everything, giving the impression of a world on hold. As they venture further into the city, they come across scenes that are both perplexing and unsettling. Cars are abandoned in the middle of the road, their engines still running. Homes are in disarray, as if their inhabitants had vanished into thin air. The survivors are confronted with the unsettling reality that they may be among the only humans left alive. The absence of air has wiped out the world's population, leaving them in a post-apocalyptic wasteland. The enormity of their situation weighs heavily on them. They are truly alone in a world that has been stripped bare. With the knowledge that they are likely the last remnants of humanity, they face an uncertain future. The absence of air has not only taken away their world, but also their past, present, and future. Standing amidst the ruins of civilization, they are left to grapple with the profound solitude of being the last humans alive. As the sun sets over the desolate landscape, the survivors seek shelter in a building, huddling together for warmth and comfort. The vastness of the empty sky above them serves as a constant reminder of their isolation. In the flickering shadows of their makeshift shelter, they share their stories, their voices echoing in the stillness. With each shared memory, they keep alive the essence of humanity, ensuring that their experiences don't fade into oblivion. As the night deepens, the survivors are beset by fear and uncertainty. The silence is broken by the howling wind, creating an eerie symphony of despair. They cling to each other for support, finding solace in their shared humanity. In the depths of their despair, they are confronted with the harsh realities of their existence. Food and water are scarce, and the threat of starvation and dehydration looms over them. The silence of the empty world amplifies their every move, making each action resonate with the finality of their situation. Despite the bleak circumstances, Sarah refuses to give in to despair. Drawing strength from the thought of her family, she rallies the others, reminding them that as long as they live, there is hope. Together, they devise strategies to conserve their dwindling resources, their determination to survive unwavering. As the days turn into weeks, the survivors face a constant struggle against the elements. The absence of air has disrupted the natural cycle, leaving them exposed to extreme weather conditions. Storms rage outside, shaking their shelter and threatening to wipe away their last vestiges of hope. Driven by desperation, John ventures out into the wasteland to search for supplies. He braves the elements, scouring abandoned homes and stores in the hopes of finding sustenance. His journey becomes a testament to the lengths one will go to ensure their survival. Upon his return, John brings back vital supplies, offering a glimmer of hope in their desperate situation. With renewed determination, they continue their fight for survival, their bonds deepening with each passing day. As time goes by, the survivors adapt to their new reality. They learn to forage for food and purify water from natural sources. They turn their shelter into a sustainable habitat, growing crops in makeshift gardens and raising small livestock. Their days are filled with the tasks of survival, and their nights are spent sharing stories and dreams of the world that was. Amidst the challenges, they find moments of joy, celebrating small victories and cherishing the warmth of human connection. One day, while exploring the desolate city, Sarah stumbles upon a radio tower. With a surge of excitement, she climbs to the top, hoping to establish contact with anyone who might be out there. Her voice echoes through the airwaves, carrying a message of hope and resilience. As she broadcasts, she pours her heart out, sharing their story and expressing the longing for human connection. The silence of the airwaves is deafening, but she doesn't falter. She continues to send out their SOS signal, clinging to the belief that someone, somewhere might be listening. Days turn into weeks, and Sarah's hope begins to dwindle. The absence of a response weighs heavily on her spirit, a constant reminder of their isolation. Yet she refuses to give up. Each time she climbs the tower, she carries with her the dreams and aspirations of her fellow survivors. Then one fateful day, as Sarah reaches the peak of the radio tower, her ears detect a faint transmission. Her heart pounds as she adjusts the dials, trying to decipher the message. Suddenly, a voice crackles through the speakers, breaking the silence that has echoed through the airwaves for so long. Tears well up in Sarah's eyes as she realizes that she is not alone. There is someone out there, a survivor who has managed to thrive in the absence of air. With trembling hands, she responds, her voice filled with emotion. In that moment, the weight of their isolation seems to lift slightly. The knowledge that there is another survivor out there rekindles a spark of hope within them. The prospect of connecting with another human being, sharing their experiences and possibly finding a way to rebuild, fills them with determination. As Sarah concludes her conversation, she exchanges coordinates with the other survivor, setting the stage for a reunion. The silence that had once enveloped them now holds the promise of companionship and the faint glimmer of hope for a shared future. Long before humans ever drew their first breath, oxygen was already reshaping the very foundations of existence. Journey back 2.5 billion years to an Earth that would have been utterly alien to modern eyes. The sky held no blue. The seas ran red with iron, and the air itself carried poison, at least what would have been poison to creatures like us. This was a world ruled by ancient bacteria that breathed methane and exhaled oxygen as waste. For millions of years, they pumped this toxic gas into the atmosphere, unknowing architects of a revolution that would transform everything. The Great Oxidation Event, scientists call it now. Though event seems too gentle a word for what was, in truth, the largest extinction in Earth's history. As oxygen levels rose, the old world died. Entire lineages of life, perfectly adapted to an oxygen-free existence, simply vanished. The very air became their undoing. Yet from this apocalypse, something extraordinary emerged. Oxygen is a hungry element. It seizes electrons, burns through barriers, tears apart the comfortable stability that simpler life forms had enjoyed. But this destructive power, when properly harnessed, becomes the key to unimaginable complexity. With oxygen, cells could extract 20 times more energy from the same resources. They could build larger structures, support more elaborate processes, dream bigger dreams. Picture the first complex cell that learned to breathe oxygen. Imagine that moment when destruction became creation, when what had been poison transformed into the fuel for consciousness itself. Every animal that has ever lived, every human thought, every work of art or scientific discovery, all of it made possible by this ancient molecular alchemy. The element threads through every aspect of existence in ways both obvious and hidden. In your blood, oxygen molecules ride like passengers on red cellular trains, carrying energy to every corner of your body. In the soil beneath your feet, it helps decompose fallen leaves into nutrients for new growth. In the upper atmosphere, it transforms into ozone, a thin shield that protects all life from deadly radiation. But oxygen's role extends far beyond biology. It binds atoms together in the concrete of our cities, the steel of our bridges, the glass of our windows. It feeds the fires that power our civilization, not just the obvious flames of candles and campfires, but the controlled explosions in every car engine, the coal-burning furnaces that generate electricity, the chemical reactions that create the materials of modern life. Most remarkably, oxygen carries within itself the memory of stars. Every molecule that enters your lungs was forged in the nuclear heart of a sun, many times larger than our own. When that ancient star reached the end of its life, it scattered its oxygen across space in a final, brilliant explosion. Billions of years later, that same oxygen found its way to a small blue planet, where it would one day fill human lungs and human dreams. This cosmic connection means that losing oxygen, even for 5 seconds, would be more than biological catastrophe. It would be a severing of our deepest link to the universe itself, a momentary return to the cold, empty void from which we all emerged. In the silence of those 5 seconds, perhaps we might finally hear what our ancestors always knew, but we have forgotten: that every breath is a gift borrowed from the stars, and every exhalation a prayer of gratitude for the cosmic accident that made consciousness possible. The ancient bacteria that first created our breathable atmosphere could never have imagined the world they were creating. Yet their invisible labor, carried out in primordial seas under alien skies, set in motion a chain of events that would one day produce Mozart's symphonies, Van Gogh's sunflowers, and the words you're reading now. All of it balanced on the knife's edge of oxygen's presence. All of it vulnerable to oxygen's absence. In the first second, no one would notice. The change would be utterly invisible, silent as the space between stars. Children would continue playing in schoolyards. Office workers would type at their keyboards. Lovers would whisper to each other in 1,000 different languages. The great machinery of human civilization would carry forward on momentum, unaware that the fundamental chemistry of existence had just shifted. But the Earth would know. Across the planet, every flame, from the pilot light in a grandmother's stove to the massive furnaces of steel mills, would simply cease. Not with dramatic flourish or billowing smoke, but with the gentle finality of a candle being snuffed. Fires that had burned continuously for decades, sacred flames tended by monks in mountain monasteries, the eternal flame at memorial sites, all extinguished in perfect synchrony. The silence would be profound. Every internal combustion engine on Earth would stop, not with coughs and sputters, but with sudden, complete quiet. Cars on highways would coast forward, their drivers pressing accelerator pedals that no longer had any effect. Airplanes, 30,000 feet above the ground, would become gliders in an instant, their jet engines as useless as sculptures. By the second, the structural changes would begin. Deep in the heart of mountains, where ancient rock has been compressed for millions of years, the bonds holding atoms together would weaken. Oxygen is the invisible glue in much of Earth's architecture, woven into the molecular structure of concrete, steel, and stone. Without it, buildings wouldn't explode or crumble dramatically. They would simply settle. Sag. The rigid lines of human engineering would soften like ice cream in summer heat. The ocean, covering 70% of Earth's surface, would respond with its own form of chaos. Dissolved oxygen vanishing from the water would trigger mass confusion among marine life. Schools of fish would scatter in all directions, their primitive nervous systems registering something catastrophically wrong without understanding what. Whales, already holding their breath during deep dives, would find themselves in an alien sea when they surfaced. Meanwhile, the sky itself would transform. The brilliant blue that poets have celebrated for millennia depends entirely on oxygen molecules scattering sunlight. With those molecules gone, the atmosphere would turn black as midnight, even at noon. Stars would become visible in broad daylight, not twinkling gently as they do at night, but shining with the steady intensity they show to astronauts in space. Humanity would glimpse, for 5 terrible seconds, the true darkness that surrounds our small blue sanctuary. By the 3rd second, the biological catastrophe would accelerate. Every human being on Earth, from newborns in hospital nurseries to centenarians in their beds, would feel their lungs collapse slightly inward. Not painfully, not dramatically, but with the subtle wrongness of air that refuses to satisfy. Athletes in the middle of marathons would stumble. Deep-sea divers would face the peculiar horror of equipment that no longer delivers the breath of life. Hospital patients on oxygen support would watch their machines continue to function while providing nothing but empty volume. Birds, perhaps the most immediately vulnerable, would begin falling from the sky. Not in great dramatic swarms, but individually, their wings suddenly unable to find purchase in air that had lost its essential substance. A hawk circling above a meadow would find itself in freefall, its keen eyes watching the ground rush upward, while its brain struggled to process the impossibility. In the fourth second, the cascade of consequences would begin to interact with each other in ways no human mind could fully calculate. Power plants would shut down, not because their machinery had failed, but because the chemistry of combustion had simply stopped working. Backup systems would engage automatically, only to discover that they too depended on processes that required oxygen. The silence would be absolute now. No engines running, no fires crackling, no power stations humming. Just the sound of wind, air that still moved, but could no longer sustain the chemical reactions that power civilization. And then, in the fifth second, just as suddenly as it vanished, oxygen would return. The air would flood back into the world like water through a broken dam. Lungs would expand again. Hearts would find their rhythm. Fires would spark back to life, but not all of them. Not in the same places. Not with the same gentle reliability humanity had always assumed. In those 5 seconds, the world would have learned that everything we call normal, every breath, every flame, every structural stability we take for granted, hangs by the thinnest possible thread. A thread woven from the death songs of ancient stars, and as fragile as morning mist. The return of oxygen would not mean the return of the world as it was. Some changes, once begun, cannot be undone. Some collapses, once started, continue long after their cause is past. 5 seconds. Long enough to change everything. Brief enough that some might convince themselves it never happened at all. Picture Manhattan Island at precisely 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon. 8 million people moving through concrete canyons, their lives suspended hundreds of feet above the bedrock. Supported by an intricate web of chemistry they never think to question. The steel beams that hold their skyscrapers skyward are not pure iron. They are alloys, carefully engineered combinations of metal and oxygen that create strength far beyond what either element could achieve alone. The concrete in every sidewalk, every foundation, every wall depends on oxygen to maintain its molecular integrity. Even the glass in the windows, that transparent miracle that lets light in while keeping weather out, exists only because of oxygen as patient work, binding silicon atoms into crystalline order. In those 5 seconds of absence, all of it would begin to fail. Not with Hollywood drama, no explosions, no buildings pancaking into rubble. The failure would be subtler and far more unnerving. A gradual softening, as if the entire city were a sandcastle touched by an incoming wave. Skyscrapers would sway more than they should. Windows would develop hairline cracks that hadn't been there moments before. The rigid geometry of human ambition would begin to sag under its own weight. Meanwhile, beneath the streets, the circulatory system of the city would convulse. Natural gas lines carry fuel to millions of stoves and furnaces, but gas burns only in the presence of oxygen. For 5 seconds, every gas appliance in the city would become nothing more than decorative metal. Water treatment plants, which use controlled bacterial processes that require oxygen, would struggle to continue their essential work. The complex chemistry that keeps 8 million people fed, housed, and healthy would falter. But Manhattan is just one city. Multiply this scene by thousands, and the scope becomes almost incomprehensible. In Tokyo, the bullet trains racing across the countryside at 300 kilometers per hour would suddenly find their engines as silent as sculptures. The trains would coast forward on momentum alone, their passengers pressed into their seats, not by acceleration, but by the gradual deceleration of vehicles that could no longer propel themselves. The precision timing that moves millions of people through one of the world's most complex transportation networks would dissolve into chaos. In London, centuries-old buildings held together by lime mortar, itself an oxygen-dependent compound, would experience stresses they were never designed to handle. Westminster Abbey, St. Paul's Cathedral, structures that have weathered wars and weather for 800 years, would suddenly feel the weight of their own history in new and troubling ways. The global power grid, that invisible nervous system of modern civilization, would face cascading failures as coal plants, gas plants, and even some solar installations found themselves unable to function. Backup generators would try to engage, only to discover that their diesel engines could no longer burn fuel. Battery systems would continue working, but batteries don't last forever, and the systems to recharge them would be offline. Perhaps most unsettling would be the silence in hospitals. Operating rooms, where surgeons work by the light of precision bulbs, would plunge into darkness as power failed. But more immediately dangerous, the oxygen tanks that keep critically ill patients alive would become useless. Not because the tanks would empty, they would still be full of oxygen molecules, but because those molecules would be unable to sustain the chemical processes of human metabolism. Patients who had been stable would suddenly find themselves in crisis, their bodies rejecting the very element they needed most. Air traffic control centers around the world would watch their screens fill with aircraft in distress. Thousands of planes, caught mid-flight when their engines died, would begin emergency descents. Pilots trained for every conceivable crisis would face something entirely unprecedented. Aircraft that were mechanically perfect, but chemically powerless. The sky, normally filled with the organized flow of commercial aviation, would become a three-dimensional puzzle of gliding vehicles, each racing to find a place to land before momentum ran out. Yet even as infrastructure crumbled and systems failed, perhaps the most profound change would be psychological. For 5 seconds, every human being on Earth would confront the reality that civilization is not built on solid ground, but on the constant presence of an invisible gas. The reliability of electricity, the strength of buildings, the safety of transportation, all of it revealed as dependent on something so basic that most people never think about it. The architects who design our cities calculate load-bearing weights and wind resistance and seismic stability. They do not calculate for the sudden absence of oxygen from their materials. The engineers who plan our transportation systems account for weather and traffic and mechanical failure. They do not account for the chemistry of combustion simply ceasing to work. In those 5 seconds, the hubris of human engineering would meet the humility of cosmic dependence. Every bridge, every airplane, every smartphone and surgical instrument would be revealed as a temporary arrangement of atoms held together by forces far more delicate than their solid appearance suggests. When oxygen returned, the immediate crisis would pass. Engines would restart, fires would rekindle, the power grid would slowly come back online. But the memory would linger, the knowledge that our most advanced technologies, our proudest achievements, our entire urban civilization stands balanced on a foundation as thin as air. And air, as those 5 seconds would prove, is far more fragile than we ever dared imagine. In the ancient Sanskrit texts of India, they called it prana, the vital breath that flows through all living things. Not merely air entering and leaving the lungs, but the fundamental life force that animates the cosmos. Hindu mystics spent lifetimes learning to perceive this invisible energy, to direct it through meditation and yoga, to understand its deeper mysteries. They spoke of prana as if it were almost ... fragile, as if this essential force could withdraw from the world, leaving behind only empty shells of matter. Halfway around the world, Greek philosophers developed their own understanding. Pneuma, they called it, the divine breath that gave life to clay, the spirit that transformed mere matter into conscious beings. Aristotle wrote extensively about pneuma's role, not just in biology, but in the fundamental structure of reality itself. Without pneuma, he suggested, the physical world would simply collapse. An odd coincidence, perhaps. Or perhaps ancient wisdom, preserved knowledge that modern science has forgotten. Travel further east to the mountains of Tibet, where Bon shamans spoke of Lung, the wind horse that carries the soul between worlds. In their cosmology, this vital wind could be disturbed, blocked, or even temporarily withdrawn by cosmic forces beyond human understanding. When this happened, they claimed both individual consciousness and the physical world itself would suffer profound disruption. The Chinese developed perhaps the most sophisticated understanding of all. Qi, they named it, the flowing energy that underlies everything from personal health to the movement of planets. Traditional Chinese medicine maps Qi's circulation through the human body with the same precision that modern doctors map blood flow. But Qi was never understood as merely personal. It was seen as a universal force, connecting every breath to the breath of heaven itself. What's remarkable about these ancient traditions is not just their focus on breath and vital energy, but their consistent warning that this energy could be withdrawn. In the Bhagavata Purana, there are verses describing cosmic cycles where the very air becomes thin and unable to sustain life. The text speaks of kalpa endings, times when the fundamental elements of existence temporarily retreat from the world. During these moments, it claims, even the gods hold their breath and wait for creation to remember itself. Norse mythology tells of Ragnarok, but also of smaller cosmic disruptions, moments when the world tree Yggdrasil shudders and the 9 realms briefly disconnect from each other. In these stories, warriors and gods alike find themselves gasping for air that no longer satisfies, struggling to breathe winds that have lost their power to sustain life. The Mayan Popol Vuh contains perhaps the most intriguing reference of all. It describes periods when the breath of Hurakan, the wind god, is withdrawn from the world. During these times, the text claims, fires go out spontaneously, structures built by men collapse without external force, and even the strongest warriors fall to their knees as if the air itself had abandoned them. These are not vague metaphors or poetic imagery. The descriptions are startlingly specific, almost clinical in their detail. They speak of simultaneous fire extinctions, structural failures, and respiratory distress occurring across vast regions. They describe skies that turn black in daylight and stars that become visible when they should be hidden. Modern scholars dismiss these accounts as mythology, symbolic stories about spiritual rather than physical realities. But what if the ancients were not speaking metaphorically? What if they were preserving in the only language available to them, the memory of actual events? Consider the precision with which these traditions describe the aftermath of such events. The Vedic texts speak of the return of prana, bringing not just renewed breathing, but also the rekindling of fires, the restoration of structural integrity, and the slow healing of both individual and cosmic disruption. The timeline they describe, brief withdrawal followed by gradual recovery, matches exactly what we might expect from a temporary oxygen depletion. In Egypt, the myth of Ari's nightly journey through the underworld includes a moment when the breath of life is withdrawn from the world. During this time, it's said, all flames are extinguished and must be rekindled by divine intervention. The morning's return of the sun represents not just light conquering darkness, but breath returning to a world that had briefly forgotten how to sustain itself. Perhaps most intriguingly, many of these traditions include specific instructions for surviving such events. Tibetan Buddhism teaches breathing techniques designed to store life wind within the body. Yoga traditions include practices meant to prepare practitioners for times when external prana might be unavailable. Chinese Qigong includes exercises specifically aimed at maintaining internal qi circulation when external qi is disrupted. Were these practices developed through pure theoretical speculation? Or were they passed down from ancestors who had actually experienced something like the 5-second absence we're reimagining? Aboriginal Australian Dreamtime stories speak of brief moments when The breath of the rainbow serpent withdraws from the world. During these times, they say, all life must rely on its own inner breath rather than the shared breath of the earth. The stories include detailed survival wisdom, how to remain conscious when the air loses its power, how to help others through such moments, how to recognize when the great breath is about to return. These are not primitive superstitions, but sophisticated understandings of the relationship between consciousness, breath, and cosmic forces. Whether they describe real events or explore profound spiritual truths, they all point toward the same unsettling possibility, that the air we breathe is not as reliable as we assume. In those 5 seconds of oxygen absence, perhaps humanity would rediscover ancient truths that modern science has overlooked. Perhaps we would understand, finally, why our ancestors treated breath as sacred, why they developed such elaborate practices around respiratory awareness, why they warned of times when the very air might betray us. The myths speak. The question is whether we still know how to listen. Beneath the surface of every sea, an invisible forest sways in currents older than continents. These are the phytoplankton, microscopic organisms so small that millions could fit in a teaspoon of seawater, yet so numerous that their combined mass exceeds all the fish, whales, and dolphins in the ocean. They drift through the blue depths like living snowflakes, each one a tiny factory, converting sunlight and carbon dioxide into the oxygen that fills your lungs. Every second breath you take comes from the ocean. This is not a metaphor or approximation. 50% of Earth's oxygen is produced by marine phytoplankton, tiny drifters whose existence most people never consider. While rainforests capture our imagination as the lungs of the earth, it is actually these microscopic sea dwellers that keep us breathing. They are the ocean's gift to the sky, the marriage of water and air that makes complex life possible. In those 5 seconds of oxygen absence, the sea would react in ways both subtle and catastrophic. Picture the Mediterranean at sunset, its surface painted gold by the dying light. Beneath that beauty, countless phytoplankton continue their ancient work, producing oxygen through photosynthesis. But they also consume oxygen through respiration, just as land plants do during the night hours. When oxygen vanishes from both water and air simultaneously, the delicate balance that has maintained marine ecosystems for hundreds of millions of years would suddenly collapse. The first to feel the change would be the creatures at the very top of the marine food chain and the very bottom. Great blue whales, surfacing after deep dives, would break through waves expecting to fill their massive lungs with life-giving air, only to find the atmosphere as empty as space. Their bodies, perfectly evolved for holding breath during extended underwater hunts, would suddenly face an impossible situation, the surface offering no relief from the growing hunger for oxygen in their blood. Meanwhile, in the deepest trenches of the ocean, where strange creatures have adapted to low oxygen environments that would kill surface dwellers instantly, even these extremophiles would face crisis. The dissolved oxygen that seeps down from surface waters and supports the deep-sea food web would begin to shift and change in ways their ancient metabolisms could not accommodate. But perhaps most dramatic would be the response of the ocean's middle depths, those vast blue spaces where most marine life makes its home. Schools of tuna, their bodies built for speed and efficient oxygen extraction, would scatter in confusion as their gills stopped being able to pull life from the water around them. Dolphins and porpoises, mammals like ourselves, would face the double catastrophe of empty lungs above and oxygen-depleted seas below. Their sophisticated echolocation might detect the sudden absence, the way sound travels differently, through water when its chemistry changes so fundamentally. Coral reefs, those underwater rainforests that support 25% of all marine species, would experience their own form of crisis. The symbiotic algae living within coral tissues produce oxygen during daylight hours, but corals themselves consume oxygen continuously. In 5 seconds of absence, the delicate partnership between coral animals and their photosynthetic guests would face stress beyond anything in their evolutionary history. The ocean's chemistry would shift in subtle but profound ways. Dissolved oxygen is not just a respiratory requirement for marine life. It drives crucial chemical reactions that maintain the sea pH balance. Its nutrient cycling, its ability to support the complex web of relationships that connects every drop of seawater to every other. Remove oxygen briefly, and you disrupt processes that have maintained oceanic stability for geological ages. Surface waters would respond most quickly. The foam and spray of breaking waves, normally full of tiny air bubbles that help oxygenate the sea, would carry empty spaces instead. The interaction between atmosphere and ocean, that constant exchange of gases that helps regulate global climate, would simply stop. For 5 seconds, the sea would be cut off from the sky, isolated in a way it has never been since liquid water first appeared on Earth. Deep ocean currents, those massive rivers of water that circulate heat and nutrients around the globe, depend on density differences partly created by dissolved oxygen levels. The thermaline circulation that prevents ice ages and maintains regional climates would face disruption as the chemistry of seawater shifted in ways that no computer model has ever been programmed to simulate. But perhaps most haunting would be the silence. The ocean is never truly quiet. Even in the deepest abyssal plains, there is always the sound of life, the clicks and calls of marine mammals, the subtle movements of countless creatures, the chemical processes that sustain underwater ecosystems. In those 5 seconds, as oxygen vanished and marine life struggled to comprehend what was happening, the sea might experience something it has never known: true silence. Fish possess lateral line systems that detect the slightest changes in water chemistry and pressure. They would sense the absence of oxygen like a great emptiness sweeping through their world. Whales, with their sophisticated nervous systems and long memories, might carry the trauma of those 5 seconds for the rest of their lives. A brief but unforgettable moment when the ocean itself seemed to abandon them. When oxygen returned, the sea would gradually heal. Marine life would recover, currents would restabilize, the great cycles of oceanic chemistry would resume. But something would have changed. The ocean would have experienced its own form of cosmic loneliness. 5 seconds when it was cut off from the sky that gives it life. And in coastal waters around the world, human witnesses would see something that would haunt them forever. The moment when the sea itself seemed to gasp for breath and found only emptiness where life should have been waiting. There is something almost sacred about flame. Since the first human ancestors learned to kindle fire in African caves, light carved from darkness has represented knowledge, warmth, hope, the triumph of consciousness over the cold indifference of the universe. Every candle lit in prayer, every hearth that warms a home, every birthday cake glowing with wishes carries the genetic memory of that first miracle, the taming of combustion. Fire is oxygen made visible, chemistry transformed into light and heat and dancing beauty. Without oxygen, there can be no flame. In those 5 seconds of absence, every fire on Earth would die as quickly and quietly as a sigh. Picture the Vatican at evening prayer. In St. Peter's Basilica, hundreds of votive candles burn before statues and altars, their flames fed by centuries of human devotion. Each candle represents a prayer, a hope, a soul reaching toward the divine. The golden light flickers across ancient marble, creating shadows that have danced the same dance for generations. At the moment of oxygen's disappearance, every flame would simply vanish. Not with the dramatic guttering of candles and wind, not with smoke and struggle, but with the finality of a light switch being turned off. The basilica would plunge into darkness, so complete that the faithful gathered in prayer would think the world itself had ended. The eternal flame that has burned before the high altar, tended continuously by Vatican staff, would become merely a cold wick above a pool of wax. Multiply this scene by millions, and the scope becomes breathtaking. In Hindu temples across India, Sacred fires that have burned continuously for over 1,000 years would be extinguished in the same instant. The Agni-Hotra flame in Varanasi, the ancient fires of Tamil Nadu temples, the ceremonial burning ghats along the Ganges, all would go dark together, as if the gods themselves had drawn a single breath and held it. The Olympic flame in whatever city happens to be hosting the games would die alongside the pilot light in a grandmother's kitchen in Ohio, the memorials that honor the dead, the eternal flame at John F. Kennedy's grave, the torch at the tomb of the unknown soldier, would suddenly become cold stone and metal, their symbolic power as extinguished as their physical presence. But the disappearance of flame would mean more than symbolic loss. Modern civilization burns things constantly, usually in carefully controlled ways that most people never see or think about. Power plants burn coal, oil, and natural gas to generate electricity. Steel mills burn fuel to reach the temperatures needed to forge metal. Chemical plants use controlled combustion to create everything from plastic to pharmaceuticals. All of it would stop at once. Picture a coal-fired power plant in China, its massive boilers consuming tons of fuel every hour to generate electricity from millions of homes. The flames inside these industrial furnaces burn at temperatures that would melt copper, contained within chambers built to withstand forces that would destroy buildings. At the moment oxygen vanished, these infernos would not explode or rage out of control. They would simply cease to exist, leaving behind only cooling chambers full of unburned fuel. The silence would be unprecedented in human history. For the first time since the Industrial Revolution began, no fuel would be burning anywhere on Earth. No engines firing, no furnaces roaring, no controlled explosions powering the machinery of progress. The constant background hum of combustion that has accompanied human civilization for centuries would stop, leaving a quietude so complete that those who survived would speak of it for generations. Aircraft engines, those precisely engineered marvels that burn jet fuel with enough controlled violence to lift hundreds of tons into the sky, would become as silent as sculptures. Pilots would watch their instruments in disbelief as engines that had been running perfectly simply ... stopped. Not seized, not damaged, not malfunctioning. Just quiet. Perhaps most eerie would be the fate of natural fires, the wildfires that burn across forests and grasslands, following patterns older than human memory. A massive forest fire consuming thousands of acres in California would vanish as completely as a single match being blown out. The superheated air would begin to cool immediately, leaving behind a landscape of unburned trees that had been seconds away from destruction. Even stranger would be the lightning. Electrical storms would continue, the movement of air masses and the buildup of electrical charge due and depend on oxygen. But lightning that struck dry grass or dead trees would create no fire. The spark that should have kindled flame would find nothing to sustain itself. The ancient dance between lightning and fire, one of nature's most spectacular displays, would be interrupted for the first time in Earth's history. In research laboratories around the world, Bunsen burners that heat chemical reactions would go dark. Scientists would watch their experiments fail as the controlled flames they depended upon simply disappeared. Decades of research into high-temperature chemistry would face an interruption that no methodology could have predicted or planned for. Glass-making factories, which require flames hot enough to turn sand into liquid, would face their own crisis. The furnaces that have operated continuously for years, because the energy cost of cooling and reheating them is too enormous, would suddenly go cold. When oxygen returned, these industrial furnaces would take days or weeks to restore to operating temperature, disrupting global supplies of everything that requires glass in its manufacture. But perhaps the most profound loss would be simply the absence of light. In our electrically illuminated world, we forget how much human civilization has historically depended on flame for visibility after dark. Even now, millions of people around the world rely on candles, oil lamps, and wood fires for light and heat. In those 5 seconds, rural villages across Africa, Asia, and South America would be plunged into a darkness more complete than the deepest cave. When oxygen returned and fires began to rekindle, the light would seem almost miraculous. That first candle flame, that first rekindled hearth, would carry symbolic weight beyond anything in human experience. People would understand, in a way their ancestors always had, that they had forgotten, that fire is not merely useful but sacred, a visible manifestation of the invisible forces that make life possible. The silence broken by the first returning flame would sound like the world learning to breathe again. Stand before the Great Pyramid of Giza on a clear morning and cut your hand to its ancient limestone blocks. Each stone weighs as much as 15 automobiles, quarried from distant mountains and transported across the desert by methods that still perplex engineers. These blocks have stood in perfect alignment for 45 centuries, surviving earthquakes, invasions, and the endless assault of wind and sand. Yet each stone is held in place not merely by weight and engineering, but by the invisible bonds that oxygen forms with calcium and silicon deep within the rock itself. Remove oxygen from the equation, and even the pyramids would begin to sag. This is the hidden secret of human architecture. We build with chemistry as much as with stone and steel. Every concrete foundation depends on oxygen to maintain the molecular bonds that give it strength. Every steel beam contains oxygen atoms woven into its crystalline structure. Even the glass in our windows exists only because oxygen helps silicon atoms form the transparent matrix that lets light pass through while keeping weather out. In those 5 seconds of absence, the very foundations of civilization would begin to soften. Picture Rome at the moment oxygen disappears. The Colosseum, that magnificent testament to imperial engineering, has stood for nearly 2,000 years. Its massive travertine blocks, its complex system of underground chambers, its ingenious architectural tricks that allow sound to carry perfectly to the highest seats, all of it suddenly vulnerable in ways its builders never imagined. The mortar between the stones would begin to weaken as oxygen-dependent compounds lost their binding power. Not dramatically, not with crashes and devastation, but with subtle shifts that would be barely perceptible to the naked eye. Hairline cracks might appear in walls that had been perfectly solid moments before. Ancient arches might develop stresses that hadn't existed for centuries. Modern construction would face even greater challenges. Reinforced concrete, the miracle material that makes skyscrapers possible, achieves its strength through a delicate partnership between cement, steel, and chemistry. The concrete provides compression strength, while embedded steel rebar handles tension forces. But both materials depend on oxygen-based compounds to maintain their structural integrity. In those 5 seconds, the invisible skeleton that holds up our cities would begin to experience fatigue it was never designed to handle. Consider the Burj Khalifa in Dubai, that gleaming spear of glass and steel that pierces the sky at over half a mile high. Its structural engineering represents the pinnacle of human achievement. Computer-modeled stresses, wind tunnel-tested aerodynamics, material science pushed to its absolute limits. Yet even this marvel would face the fundamental vulnerability that no engineer has ever needed to calculate. What happens when the chemical bonds in your construction materials begin to weaken simultaneously? The building would not collapse. 5 seconds is far too brief for catastrophic structural failure. But instruments sensitive enough to measure such things might detect microscopic changes throughout the tower's frame. Tiny movements, subtle stress redistributions, the material equivalent of a giant taking a slightly deeper breath. Perhaps more immediate would be the effects on newer construction, still in progress. Concrete that was in the process of curing, its chemical hardening dependent on oxygen-based reactions, would find that process interrupted. When oxygen returned, the curing would resume, but the brief interruption might create weaknesses that wouldn't become apparent for months or years. Ancient buildings might prove more resilient than modern ones. The medieval cathedrals of Europe were built with techniques refined over centuries of trial and error. Gothic architects understood weight and stress distribution through practical experience rather than computer calculation. Their massive stone construction relied more on precise fitting and weight distribution than on chemical bonding. Notre Dame de Paris, before the fire that damaged it, had stood for 8 centuries without depending on materials that modern chemistry makes possible. But even these monuments would not be immune. The lid that seals their windows, the iron that reinforces their stone, all of it would experience subtle changes as oxygen temporarily vanished from its molecular structure. Stained glass windows that had been perfectly stable might develop tensions they'd never felt before. In Japan, traditional wooden temples built without nails would face their own challenges. These structures achieve their remarkable earthquake resistance through precisely fitted joints that flex with ground movement. But wood itself is an oxygen-containing material, and its flexibility depends partly on the chemistry of lignin and cellulose. 5 seconds might be enough to alter the subtle properties that make these ancient buildings so resilient. Underground, the effects might be even more dramatic. Mine shafts and subway tunnels are held open against enormous geological pressures through careful engineering of support structures. The steel and concrete that line these underground spaces must resist the Earth's constant desire to close these artificial cavities. With oxygen temporarily absent from support materials, even small changes in structural integrity could have consequences that wouldn't become apparent until much later. The London Underground, with its century-old tunnels carved through clay and chalk, relies on a complex system of cast iron segments and modern reinforcement. The New York subway system threads through solid rock and unstable landfill with equal engineering audacity. Both systems would experience stresses during those 5 seconds that no safety factor had ever been designed to accommodate. Perhaps strangest of all would be the psychological effect on human inhabitants of these suddenly vulnerable structures. We live our lives surrounded by architecture we trust absolutely. We stand in elevator shafts suspended hundreds of feet above the ground without a moment's hesitation. We walk through underground passages beneath millions of tons of earth and stone without considering the forces held in check above our heads. We sleep peacefully in buildings that sway with the wind, trusting in engineering calculations we don't understand to keep us safe. In those 5 seconds, as subtle changes rippled through every constructed environment on Earth, perhaps some sensitive individuals would feel something they couldn't name, a wrongness in the very air, a sense that the solid world had become somehow less solid. When oxygen returned, the immediate crisis would pass. Materials would restabilize, chemical bonds would reform, the hidden architecture of molecular engineering would resume its invisible work. But somewhere in the deepest foundations of the world's greatest buildings, in places where no human eye would ever see, microscopic changes would remain as permanent reminders of 5 seconds when chemistry itself had held its breath. The pyramids would still stand, as they had for millennia. But perhaps, in ways too subtle for casual observation, they would stand slightly differently than they had before. Look up at the night sky on a clear evening, far from city lights, and you'll see roughly 3,000 stars with the naked eye. Each point of light represents a nuclear furnace burning with temperatures that would vaporize Earth in seconds. And every star you see is slowly dying, converting its mass into energy through processes so violent that they forge new elements from hydrogen and helium. The oxygen that fills your lungs right now was born in the heart of such a star. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but literally. Every oxygen atom in your blood was created when a massive star, perhaps 10 times larger than our sun, ran out of lighter elements to burn and began fusing silicon into iron, oxygen, and other heavy elements. When that ancient sun finally exhausted its fuel, it exploded in a supernova blast so brilliant it would have been visible from Earth even in daylight. That explosion scattered the star's oxygen-rich interior across light years of space, seeding the cosmic dust from which our solar system would eventually form. The oxygen in your body is stardust, carrying within its atomic structure the memory of nuclear fires that burned billions of years before Earth existed. This cosmic ancestry makes the temporary loss of oxygen something more profound than biological catastrophe. In those 5 seconds of absence, humanity would be briefly disconnected from its deepest cosmic heritage. Consider what this means on the scale of the universe. Our galaxy, the Milky Way, contains roughly 400 billion stars. Most are smaller than our Sun and will never create heavy elements through fusion. But scattered throughout the galaxy are massive stellar giants, the star factories that forge carbon, oxygen, silicon, and iron in their nuclear cores. When these giants die, they enrich space with the elements necessary for rocky planets and living things. Earth exists in what astronomers call the Goldilocks zone, around our Sun, not too hot, not too cold, but just right for liquid water. But there's another Goldilocks zone on a galactic scale. We exist in a region of the Milky Way that has been enriched by enough stellar deaths to provide the heavy elements needed for planet formation, but not so many that deadly radiation makes life impossible. Every breath you take is a cosmic inheritance, a gift from stellar ancestors you will never know. But oxygen's cosmic story extends even further back in time. The first stars that formed after the Big Bang contained only hydrogen and helium, the lightest elements created in the universe's first minutes. These primordial suns could never have produced the oxygen necessary for life. They had to live, burn, and die before heavier elements could exist anywhere in the cosmos. This means there was a time, early in the universe's history, when oxygen did not exist anywhere. Not on planets, not in space, not even as a possibility. The absence we're reimagining, 5 seconds without oxygen, would be a brief return to that primordial state, a momentary reconnection with the time before stars had learned to create the elements of life. The scale of this cosmic recycling is breathtaking. Astronomers estimate that the calcium in your bones has been through at least 6 different stars before reaching Earth. The iron in your blood may have been forged in a stellar explosion that occurred when the universe was half its current age. And the oxygen in your cells has traveled unimaginable distances, drifting through space for billions of years before finally arriving at a small blue planet where it would power consciousness itself. In those 5 seconds of absence, perhaps some part of us would remember this journey. Perhaps the cells of our bodies, temporarily deprived of their stellar inheritance, would experience a kind of homesickness, a longing for the nuclear fires where they were born. The timing of oxygen's arrival on Earth tells its own remarkable story. For the first billion years of our planet's existence, the atmosphere contained virtually no free oxygen. Early life forms actually produced oxygen as a toxic waste product. Only gradually did some organisms learn to use this reactive gas as fuel for more complex metabolism. This means that oxygen abundance is not the natural state of planets. Most worlds in the universe, even those that could theoretically support life, probably have little or no free oxygen in their atmospheres. Our breathable air is an anomaly, a brief flowering of cosmic chemistry that has existed for only a small fraction of universal history. From this perspective, losing oxygen for 5 seconds would not be a deviation from cosmic norms, but a temporary return to them. The universe's default state is emptiness, vacuum, the space between stars where no breath is possible. Earth's oxygen-rich atmosphere is the exception, not the rule. But perhaps most remarkably, the oxygen cycle connects us not just to the past, but to the future of the cosmos. Every star that burns today is slowly converting its mass into energy and heavier elements. The massive stars visible in tonight's sky will eventually explode and scatter their oxygen-enriched contents through space. Billions of years from now, that oxygen may find its way to planets not yet formed, where it might support forms of life not yet imagined. The breath you retaken right now is part of an unbroken chain that connects the first stellar explosions to the last star that will ever burn. You are breathing the universe's memory of nuclear fire and exhaling carbon dioxide that may one day nourish plants on worlds that circle stars not yet born. In those 5 seconds without oxygen, humanity might glimpse something our ancestors knew intuitively, but we have forgotten: that we are not separate from the cosmos, but woven into its very fabric. The air we breathe is not just Earth's gift to us, but the universe as gift to Earth, a temporary concentration of stellar ashes that makes consciousness possible for a brief moment in cosmic time. When oxygen returned flooding back into our lungs and our world, perhaps we would understand finally that every breath is a prayer of gratitude to stars that died before our planet existed, and a promise to care for elements that will outlive our species and journey onward to futures we cannot imagine. We are the universe becoming aware of itself, powered by the dying light of ancient suns. And for 5 seconds, we would remember what it means to be alone in the dark between stars, waiting for stellar fire to kindle life once more. The blue sky above your head is a lie. Not a deception, exactly, but a magic trick performed by molecules so small that trillions of them could dance on the head of a pin. The sun's light reaches Earth as white illumination, containing every color of the rainbow. But our atmosphere scatters the shorter blue wavelengths more efficiently than the longer reds and yellows. This molecular scale pinball game between photons and gas molecules paints the heavens in the color that humans have associated with infinity, possibility, and the divine. Remove oxygen from the equation, and the sky's secret would be revealed. Picture noon on a clear Tuesday in Kansas, the sun directly overhead, not a cloud visible from horizon to horizon. Farmers working in wheat fields would glance up to check the weather and see something that would freeze them in their tracks. The sky had turned black as midnight, pierced by stars that should have been invisible in daylight. Without oxygen molecules to scatter sunlight, Earth's atmosphere would become as transparent as the vacuum of space. The brilliant blue dome that poets have celebrated for millennia would simply vanish, replaced by the endless darkness that surrounds all worlds not blessed with breathable air. This transformation would be more jarring than losing the sun itself. Humans have experienced solar eclipses. We understand night. We can imagine darkness. But a black sky in broad daylight would violate every assumption about how the world works. Children playing in schoolyards would point upward in confusion. Adults would stop their cars and step outside, trying to comprehend what their eyes were telling them. The stars visible in this black daytime sky would not twinkle as they do at night. Twinkling is caused by atmospheric turbulence, moving air masses of different temperatures bending starlight as it passes through. With oxygen gone, the atmosphere would still exist, but its optical properties would change dramatically. The stars would shine with the steady, unwavering intensity that astronauts see from space. Perhaps most unsettling, the sun itself would appear different. Without atmospheric scattering to soften its edges, our star would shine as a harsh white point of light against the cosmic black. No gentle morning glow, no romantic sunset colors, just raw stellar fire unfiltered by the atmospheric chemistry that normally makes. Looking up a source of comfort rather than cosmic vertigo. The psychological impact would be profound. Throughout human history, the blue sky has served as a visual metaphor for safety, home, a protective envelope that separates us from the hostile void of space. Ancient cultures saw the sky dome as the floor of heaven, a solid barrier between the human world and the realm of the gods. Even modern humans, who understand that space extends infinitely beyond our atmosphere, find emotional comfort in looking up at blue rather than black. In those 5 seconds, every person on Earth would confront the reality that we live on a small rock hurtling through an endless dark. The protective illusion of the sky would be stripped away, revealing the cosmic truth that our ancestors feared and modern science has confirmed, we are utterly alone in an unimaginably vast emptiness, sustained only by a thin shell of gas that could disappear as easily as it had appeared. Airlines pilots would face their own unique horror. Flying at 30,000 feet, they normally navigate by reference to a clear horizon line between blue sky and Earth's surface. With the sky gone black and stars visible in all directions, the normal visual cues that help them maintain orientation would vanish. The cockpit instruments would continue working, but the human brain's basic sense of up and down would be challenged in ways that no flight training had ever prepared for. Photographers around the world would witness something unprecedented. The gentle illumination that makes outdoor photography possible depends on blue skylight, sunlight scattered by the atmosphere to create soft, even lighting. With only direct sunlight available, every outdoor scene would be harshly lit from one direction with pitch-black shadows everywhere else. The subtle gradations of light and shadow that make landscapes beautiful would be replaced by stark contrasts, more appropriate to lunar photography. But perhaps strangest of all would be the effect on navigation and timekeeping. Many cultures have developed sophisticated ways of telling time by the color and position of the sun in a blue sky. Sailors have used the sky's brightness patterns to navigate when stars and landmarks are not available. Desert travelers have read wind patterns in the way clouds move against blue backgrounds. All of this accumulated human wisdom would become useless. The sun would be visible as a white disk against black, but all the subtle environmental cues that humans have learned to read over thousands of years would simply vanish. The sky would no longer be a source of information about weather, time, or direction, just empty space punctuated by distant stars. Animals would respond with their own confusion. Many species use polarized light patterns in blue skies for navigation. Bees communicate the location of flowers through dances that reference the sun's position against the blue dome. Migrating birds use combinations of solar position, polarized light, and sky color to maintain their course across thousands of miles. With the sky gone black, these navigation systems would fail simultaneously across the globe. Bird flocks might scatter in confusion. Bee colonies might lose their ability to efficiently harvest nectar. Any creature that depended on sky-based navigation would face a crisis as fundamental as losing their sense of sight. The return of oxygen would bring one of the most beautiful sights in human history. As oxygen molecules began to resume their light-scattering dance, the black sky would gradually soften to deep purple, then violet, then the familiar blue that had been absent for what felt like an eternity. The first appearance of sky color after that cosmic darkness would seem like the world remembering how to be beautiful. Witnesses to this transformation would never again take blue sky for granted. They would understand, in a way that no textbook could teach, that the dome of heaven is not solid or permanent, but a daily gift of molecular chemistry. Every sunrise, every clear afternoon, every evening painted with sunset colors would carry new meaning for those who had seen the sky, stripped naked and revealed as the thin, precious thing it really is. The blue sky would return, but the memory of its absence would linger. In that memory, humanity would carry a new appreciation for the molecular magic that makes looking up a source of comfort rather than cosmic terror, and a deeper understanding that we live our entire lives beneath an illusion as beautiful as it is fragile. The human body contains roughly 37 trillion cells, each one a microscopic factory running thousands of chemical reactions every second. At the heart of this biological complexity lies a simple exchange. Oxygen enters, carbon dioxide leaves, and in that trade-off, the energy needed for consciousness itself is created. Every thought you think, every emotion you feel, every memory you form depends on this molecular transaction happening billions of times throughout your body without pause. Take away oxygen for 5 seconds, and the most sophisticated biological machine ever evolved would face a crisis it was never designed to handle. The lungs would be the first to register the change. though not in the way most people might expect. Your respiratory system doesn't primarily sense the presence of oxygen. It responds to the buildup of carbon dioxide in your blood. This is why you can hold your breath much longer if you hyperventilate first, clearing CO2 from your system. In those first moments of oxygen absence, most people would feel no immediate alarm. The body would continue producing carbon dioxide through cellular metabolism, but the signals that normally trigger urgent breathing wouldn't yet be overwhelming. But at the cellular level, catastrophe would be unfolding with molecular precision. Every cell in your body contains mitochondria, tiny organelles that are essentially biological power plants. These structures use oxygen to break down glucose and create ATP, the energy currency that powers everything from muscle contractions to neural impulses. When oxygen vanishes, mitochondria would attempt to switch to anaerobic metabolism, a much less efficient process that quickly produces lactic acid as a byproduct. Picture a marathon runner at mile 20 when anaerobic metabolism begins to flood muscles with lactic acid. The burning sensation, the overwhelming fatigue, the body has desperate signals to stop moving. All of this would begin happening simultaneously in every tissue of every human being on Earth. Your brain, that 3-pound universe of electrical activity that creates your sense of self, would be the most immediately vulnerable. Neural tissue consumes roughly 20% of your body as total energy, despite representing only 2% of your body weight. Brain cells have virtually no stored energy reserves. They depend on constant oxygen delivery to maintain the electrochemical gradients that make thought possible. Within the first few seconds, the most energy-demanding brain functions would begin to falter. Complex reasoning would become difficult. New memory formation would slow or stop entirely. The delicate balance of neurotransmitters that regulates mood and perception would shift in ways that might produce brief moments of confusion, euphoria, or profound disorientation. But the body's response would not be uniform or predictable. Athletes in peak physical condition, with enlarged hearts and extensive capillary networks developed through training, might weather those 5 seconds better than sedentary individuals. Their bodies are accustomed to extracting maximum efficiency from available oxygen and functioning under high metabolic stress. Conversely, people with respiratory conditions like asthma or COPD would face immediate crisis. Their already compromised breathing systems would struggle with the additional stress of air that no longer provided the chemical foundation for life. The medications they depend on, inhaled bronchodilators, supplemental oxygen, would become useless in those moments. Perhaps most vulnerable would be newborns and the elderly. Infant physiology is still adapting to the demands of breathing air rather than receiving oxygen through umbilical blood flow. Elderly individuals often have reduced lung capacity and cardiovascular efficiency that would make them less resilient to sudden oxygen deprivation. The cardiovascular system would respond with its own cascade of changes. Your heart would continue beating, but the blood it pumps would gradually lose its oxygen-carrying capacity. Red blood cells, normally bright red when saturated with oxygen, would begin to darken as hemoglobin released its molecular cargo without being able to pick up fresh supplies. Blood pressure would fluctuate as your body's automatic systems tried to compensate for reduced oxygen availability. Some individuals might experience rapid heart rates as their cardiovascular system worked harder to circulate increasingly deoxygenated blood. Others might feel faint as blood flow patterns shifted to prioritize the most essential organs. The 5-second timeline would create a peculiar medical phenomenon, symptoms appearing and disappearing before they could be properly recognized. A person might feel the beginning of oxygen deprivation, the slight lightheadedness, the subtle change in visual perception that comes with reduced neural efficiency, only to have these sensations vanish as oxygen returned to the world. Emergency rooms worldwide would later struggle to catalog and understand reports from those 5 seconds. Patients would describe symptoms that made perfect physiological sense, but had occurred too briefly for any medical intervention. Doctors would face the unprecedented challenge of treating conditions that had essentially healed themselves before help could arrive. Perhaps strangest would be the effect on human consciousness itself. The boundary between wakefulness and unconsciousness is maintained by precise chemical balances in the brain. Brief oxygen deprivation can produce moments of altered awareness, vivid hallucinations, out-of-body experiences, profound insights that seem to come from beyond normal perception. Some individuals might experience those 5 seconds as an eternity, their oxygen-deprived brains creating elaborate mental experiences in the space between heartbeats. Others might remember nothing at all, their consciousness briefly interrupted, like a light being switched off and on again. The return of oxygen would bring its own physiological drama. As breathing resumed and blood oxygen levels normalized, many people would experience a brief rush of energy and clarity. The sudden restoration of full neural function might create moments of unusual mental sharpness or emotional intensity. But in the deeper cellular structures of the human body, those 5 seconds would leave microscopic traces. Mitochondria that had switched to anaerobic metabolism would take time to fully restore their normal function. Muscle tissues that had begun producing lactic acid would need hours to clear the accumulated byproducts. Most remarkably, some individuals might discover that those 5 seconds had triggered adaptive responses they didn't know their bodies possessed. The human cardiovascular and respiratory systems contain backup mechanisms developed over millions of years of evolution. Brief exposure to oxygen deprivation might activate some of these dormant capabilities, potentially leaving people with temporarily enhanced oxygen utilization efficiency. In the days that followed, sleep patterns would be disrupted as bodies processed the stress of those 5 seconds. Dreams might be unusually vivid as brains attempted to integrate an experience that had no precedent in human memory. Some individuals might develop a lasting awareness of their breathing, a constant consciousness of the invisible process that sustains life. The human body would survive those 5 seconds, as it has survived countless other challenges throughout evolutionary history. But in the cellular memory of every person alive, there would remain the knowledge of how quickly the biological miracle of consciousness can be threatened, and how precious is the invisible element that makes every heartbeat possible. Earth has died before, not completely, not permanently, but with such thoroughness that the fossil record preserves the boundaries between worlds, thin layers of rock that mark moments when the majority of life forms simply vanished from existence. Paleontologists call these the Great Extinctions, and they read like a catalog of cosmic disasters, asteroid impacts, volcanic eruptions, climate shifts, and chemical changes that transformed the entire planet in geological heartbeats. But hidden within these ancient catastrophes lies a pattern that few have recognized. Many of Earth's mass extinctions coincide with dramatic changes in atmospheric oxygen levels. 250 million years ago, during the Permian-Triassic extinction that eliminated 90% of all marine species and 70% of all land-dwelling creatures, oxygen levels plummeted from 35% to just 15% of the atmosphere. The ancient world literally suffocated, leaving behind fossil beds that testify to one of the most complete biological collapses in planetary history. What if our imagined 5 seconds of oxygen absence is not merely theoretical speculation, but an echo of something that has happened before? Picture the Permian seas, warm and shallow, teeming with creatures that had dominated Earth for hundreds of millions of years. Trilobites scuttled across seafloors with compound eyes that could detect polarized light. Massive ammonites propelled themselves through ancient waters with jet-powered grace. Coral reefs stretched across continents, supporting ecosystems of complexity that would not be matched again for tens of millions of years. Then came the Siberian traps, volcanic eruptions so massive that they covered an area larger than modern Europe with lava flows thousands of feet thick. These eruptions didn't just spew lava. They released toxic gases, sulfur compounds, and particles that blocked sunlight for years. But most crucially, they may have triggered chemical reactions that temporarily removed oxygen from both air and sea. The extinction pattern that followed is eerily similar to what we might expect from sudden oxygen depletion. Marine creatures died first, and most completely, exactly what would happen if dissolved oxygen vanished from seawater. Flying insects, which require high oxygen concentrations to power their energy-intensive flight muscles, disappeared almost entirely from the fossil record. But some creatures survived, and their survival tells its own story. Deep-sea organisms, already adapted to low oxygen environments, weathered the crisis better than shallow water species. Certain bacteria and archaea, capable of anaerobic metabolism, actually flourished as their oxygen-dependent competitors vanished. Small mammals with more efficient respiratory systems than the massive reptiles that had dominated the landscape inherited a world their larger competitors could no longer survive in. The pattern repeats throughout geological history, though never quite as dramatically as in the Permian. The late Devonian extinction coincided with oceanic anoxia, periods when oxygen levels in seawater dropped so low that marine ecosystems collapsed. The Triassic-Jurassic boundary shows evidence of atmospheric chemistry changes that would have made breathing difficult for many land animals. Each time, recovery took millions of years. Each time, the surviving life forms were those best adapted to low oxygen conditions or most capable of rapid evolutionary change when oxygen levels returned to normal. Could these ancient extinctions have been triggered by events similar to our imagined 5-second absence, but lasting much longer? Could brief disruptions in atmospheric chemistry have cascaded into geological scale disasters? Modern atmospheric science suggests this is not as far-fetched as it might seem. Oxygen levels are maintained by a delicate balance between production, primarily by marine phytoplankton and land plants, and consumption by respiration, decomposition, and chemical weathering. Disrupt this balance significantly, and oxygen concentrations can change with surprising speed. The Snowball Earth episodes, when our planet became completely frozen for millions of years, may have been triggered partly by oxygen depletion. With photosynthesis impossible under global ice cover, atmospheric oxygen would have been consumed by geological processes until only trace amounts remained. When the ice finally melted, life faced a world chemically transformed. But perhaps most intriguing are the extinction events that show no clear geological cause. The late Ordovician extinction eliminated roughly 60% of marine species, yet the fossil record shows no evidence of volcanic catastrophe, asteroid impact, or dramatic climate change. What it does show is evidence of oceanic chemistry changes that suggest sudden shifts in oxygen availability. Could some extinctions have been caused by phenomena so brief they left no geological trace? Events measured in seconds or minutes rather than millennia? The idea seems impossible until you consider the interconnectedness of Earth's systems. Modern climate science has revealed how small changes can trigger massive cascades. The Amazon rainforest exists in a delicate balance with regional rainfall patterns. Remove the trees, and the rain stops, preventing new forests from growing. Ocean currents that regulate global temperature depend on precise density differences that could be disrupted by relatively minor chemical changes. If atmospheric oxygen were to vanish even briefly, the cascading effects might continue long after it turned. Fires would be extinguished, disrupting ecosystems that depend on regular burning. Plant photosynthesis would be interrupted, reducing oxygen production just when maximum output was needed. Marine food webs would face simultaneous crisis as dissolved oxygen vanished from surface waters. Even 5 seconds might be enough to trigger changes that would take centuries to stabilize. This perspective transforms our thought experiment into something more sobering. We're not just imagining a brief inconvenience that humanity would quickly overcome, but potentially contemplating the early stages of an extinction event. The geological record suggests that mass extinctions often begin with seemingly minor environmental changes that trigger unstoppable cascades of ecological collapse. The creatures that survived past extinctions share certain characteristics: small size, efficient metabolism, ability to survive on limited resources, rapid reproductive cycles that allow quick adaptation to changing conditions. By these criteria, humans might not be among the survivors. Our large bodies, energy-intensive brains, and complex technological dependence make us vulnerable to exactly the kind of rapid environmental change that oxygen depletion would represent. Yet we also possess something no previous species has had: the ability to understand these patterns and potentially prepare for them. We can study the fossil record, model atmospheric chemistry, and perhaps develop technologies that could help us survive brief disruptions in the invisible foundation of life. The question is whether we will recognize the warning signs in time. Throughout Earth's history, mass extinctions have often been preceded by smaller, seemingly manageable environmental changes. Species adapt to gradual shifts until suddenly they face a threshold they cannot cross. Are we approaching such a threshold now? Are the subtle changes in atmospheric chemistry that climate scientists monitor actually early warning signs of something much more dramatic? Could our imagined 5 seconds of oxygen absence be less science fiction and more prophecy? The fossil record cannot answer these questions, but it can remind us that Earth's history is written in disappearances. Every layer of stone contains the remains of creatures that once thought their world permanent, their survival assured, their dominance eternal. Somewhere in future rock layers, paleontologists millions of years from now might find a thin boundary marking our time. Whether that boundary represents a species that learned to protect its atmospheric heritage, or one that lost it, will depend on choices we make today. The echoes of ancient extinctions are still reverberating through time. The question is whether we're listening carefully enough to hear their warning. In the basement of a data center in Virginia, thousands of servers hum with the quiet intensity of digital civilization. These machines possess the thoughts of humanity, transformed into electric current, social media posts, financial transactions, streaming videos, the vast neural network of artificial intelligence learning to think. The building's cooling systems work constantly to prevent these electronic brains from overheating, while backup generators stand ready to provide power if the electrical grid fails. But no backup system was ever designed for the failure of oxygen itself. Every server in that basement depends on tiny fans to circulate air across heat sinks that keep processors from melting their own circuits. When oxygen vanishes, those fans continue spinning, but the air they move loses its ability to carry away thermal energy efficiently. Within seconds, computer processors around the world would begin experiencing heat stress that their cooling systems cannot alleviate. The internet itself would begin to fragment as servers shut down to protect themselves from overheating. Picture the moment when a Boeing 787, 40,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean, loses all engine power simultaneously. Not because of mechanical failure, not due to fuel system problems, but because the chemistry of combustion simply stops working. The aircraft becomes an enormous glider, its sophisticated fly-by-wire systems continuing to function perfectly, while the turbofan engines they control become silent sculptures of useless engineering. The pilots would face a scenario no flight simulator had ever prepared them for. Aircraft systems reporting normal function for every component except the fundamental ability to generate thrust. Emergency procedures would be useless because there would be no emergency in the traditional sense, just the sudden absence of a chemical process that aviation has taken for granted since the Wright brothers' first flight. Across the globe, every vehicle powered by internal combustion would coast to a stop. Not just cars and trucks, but ships in the middle of oceans, trains crossing continents, motorcycles on mountain highways. The constant background roar of transportation, that industrial symphony that has accompanied human civilization for over a century, would fade to silence in less time than it takes to read this sentence. Emergency services would face unprecedented challenges. Ambulances rushing to hospitals would lose power mid-journey, their diesel engines as quiet as the patients they were trying to save. Fire trucks responding to emergencies would become merely vehicles full of equipment that could no longer reach its destination. Police cars would transform from symbols of rapid response into stationary shelters for officers suddenly stranded wherever the crisis found them. But perhaps most vulnerable would be the power grid itself, that invisible nervous system that makes modern life possible. Coal plants, natural gas facilities, and oil-burning generators would shut down instantly as combustion became impossible. Nuclear plants would continue operating, their uranium fuel requiring no oxygen, but they represent only a small fraction of global electricity generation. Hydroelectric dams would keep spinning their turbines, wind farms would continue capturing the movement of air, solar panels would still convert sunlight to electricity. But these renewable sources, ironically, would become humanity's lifeline, the only electrical generation that doesn't depend on burning fuel and oxygen. The internet would not disappear entirely, but it would be transformed. Data centers in regions powered by renewables would continue operating, while those dependent on fossil fuel electricity would begin shutting down systems to preserve critical functions. The global web of information that connects every smartphone to every database would develop gaps and slow connections as server farms went offline one by one. Satellites orbiting Earth would continue functioning normally. They operate in the vacuum of space and generate power from solar panels. But the ground stations that communicate with them would face power shortages as electrical grids failed. GPS systems would keep broadcasting their signals, but fewer devices on Earth would have the power to receive them. Perhaps strangest would be the fate of renewable energy systems themselves. Solar panels would continue generating electricity, but the electrical grids they feed power into would be in chaos. Wind turbines would spin uselessly if their control systems lacked power or their output could not be transmitted to where it was needed. Hydroelectric plants might continue running, but if the distribution networks they supply had failed, their power would have nowhere to go. In homes around the world, the hierarchy of technological dependence would reveal itself with startling clarity. Devices with battery power, smartphones, laptops, flashlights, would continue working until their stored energy was exhausted. Everything else would fall silent as the electrical grid collapsed under the dual stress of lost generation capacity and surging demand from systems trying to restart. The psychological impact would be profound. Modern humans have become accustomed to technological omnipresence, the assumption that flipping a switch will produce light, pressing a button will start an engine, touching a screen will connect us to the sum of human knowledge. In those 5 seconds, every one of these expectations would be violated simultaneously. Children who had never experienced a moment without electronic entertainment would confront silence. Adults who conduct their professional lives through digital devices would face the strange reality of workplaces that no longer functioned. Elderly individuals dependent on electronic medical devices would find themselves suddenly vulnerable in ways their families had never imagined. But technology would also reveal unexpected resilience. Ham radio operators, those hobbyists often dismissed as anachronistic, would find their battery-powered equipment still functional when commercial communications networks failed. Mechanical devices, wind-up clocks, manual tools, bicycles would continue working as if nothing had happened, suddenly elevated from curiosities to essential technologies. When oxygen returned and engines could fire again, the recovery would not be immediate. Power plants designed for controlled startup procedures would require hours or days to return to full operation. Transportation networks would face massive coordination challenges as vehicles stranded in the middle of journeys tried to resume their interrupted travels simultaneously. The aviation industry would face perhaps the greatest recovery challenge. Thousands of aircraft would be scattered across the globe wherever they had managed to make emergency landings when their engines failed. Airports would be clogged with planes that had arrived unexpectedly and passengers whose journeys had been interrupted mid-flight. The complex scheduling that keeps global aviation running smoothly would take weeks to restore. Yet in the aftermath, humanity might also discover technological innovations inspired by those 5 seconds of vulnerability. Engineers would begin designing backup systems that didn't depend on combustion. Computer networks would be redesigned to be more resilient to power grid failures. Transportation systems might incorporate more diversity in their power sources. The memory of technology as sudden silence would spark a renaissance in mechanical engineering, devices that work without electricity, engines that don't require combustion, communication systems that function when digital networks fail. The 5 seconds would teach humanity that our most sophisticated achievements rest on foundations more fragile than we had ever imagined. In that brief silence, we would hear the echo of a world before engines, before electricity, before the industrial symphony that has been humanity's soundtrack for centuries. And in hearing that silence, we might finally understand both the magnitude of what we have built and the delicacy of the chemical processes that make it all possible. Deep in the Amazon rainforest, where Spanish conquistadors never penetrated and satellite imagery has only recently begun to reveal the extent of human modification, indigenous shamans still tell stories of the time when the breath of the world stopped. These tales passed down through oral tradition for generations, beyond counting, describe days when fires would not burn, when the sky turned black as night in the middle of the day, and when even the strongest warriors fell to their knees, gasping for air that would not sustain life. The stories were dismissed by anthropologists as symbolic mythology until researchers began finding similar accounts scattered across cultures that had no historical contact with each other. In the highlands of Tibet, Bon shamans speak of the windless time when the Longtang, the wind horse that carries prayers to heaven, abandoned the world. During this period, they claim, the mountains themselves began to crumble, and only those who had mastered inner breathing practices could survive while the outer breath was absent. Half a world away, in the oral traditions of Australian Aboriginal peoples, Dreamtime stories describe the rainbow serpent briefly withdrawing its breath from the world, leaving behind a silence so complete that even the ancestors could not speak. The land itself, they say, began to soften and change shape during these periods, as if the very rocks had forgotten how to maintain their form. These scattered mythologies might be dismissed as coincidence, were it not for their remarkable consistency in describing specific physical phenomena: the simultaneous extinction of all fires, the darkening of daytime skies, structural changes to buildings and landscapes, and the strange behavior of animals and plants during periods when the air forgot how to give life. The Mayan Chilam Balam texts contain perhaps the most detailed account of all. They describe cycles when the breath of Hurakan, the wind god from whom we derive the word hurricane, would be temporarily withdrawn from the world. During these times, the codices claim all flames would die at once. The blue of the sky would disappear to reveal the black face of night day, and even the copal incense, burned in sacred ceremonies, would refuse to light. The Mayan account goes further, describing the aftermath of these events. It speaks of the time of rekindling, when fires had to be relit simultaneously across the land, and of the days of confusion that followed as people struggled to understand what they had experienced. The texts suggest that these events occurred at regular intervals, following astronomical cycles that Mayan astronomers had calculated with their characteristic mathematical precision. In ancient Egypt, hieroglyphic texts from the Temple of Edfu describe periods when the breath of Ra would be withdrawn from the world during the god's nightly journey through the underworld. But unlike the daily sunset, these special nights were said to occur rarely, bringing with them the extinction of all sacred flames that normally burned continuously in temple sanctuaries. The Egyptian account is particularly intriguing because it connects these events to specific astronomical observations. The text suggests that the withdrawal of divine breath coincided with the appearance of certain star patterns that were visible only when the sky became as the void between worlds. Modern astronomers might recognize this as a description of stars that would normally be invisible due to atmospheric scattering suddenly becoming visible in a darkened daytime sky. Perhaps most remarkably, several of these traditions include specific instructions for surviving such events. Tibetan Bon practices include breathing techniques designed to store the wind horse within the body for times when external lung ta is unavailable. Hindu pranayama includes advanced practices meant to prepare the practitioner for periods when outer prana withdraws to its cosmic source. These survival techniques show surprising sophistication in their understanding of respiratory physiology. They emphasize slow, controlled breathing to maximize oxygen extraction from each breath, the use of specific body positions to optimize lung capacity, and mental practices to maintain consciousness when oxygen levels are reduced. The Aboriginal Australian traditions include detailed knowledge about which plants and animals would behave strangely during breathless times, and how to read these signs to predict when such events might occur. They speak of certain birds that would fall silent hours before the breath withdrawal, and of particular trees whose leaves would curl in specific ways as if preparing for air that could no longer sustain them. If these accounts describe real historical events rather than purely symbolic stories, they raise profound questions about the stability of Earth's atmosphere and the completeness of our geological record. Brief atmospheric disruptions might leave no trace in rock layers or ice cores, yet still create experiences traumatic enough to be preserved in human memory for thousands of years. The global distribution of these stories is particularly puzzling. How could cultures separated by vast oceans and developing in complete isolation from each other create such similar accounts of atmospheric disruption? The conventional explanation is that these represent universal human anxieties about breathing and survival, expressed through similar symbolic frameworks. But what if the similarities exist because the events they describe actually happened? What if Earth's atmospheric chemistry has experienced brief disruptions throughout human history, events too short to leave geological evidence, but significant enough to be preserved in cultural memory? Some researchers have noted correlations between traditional accounts of breathless times and periods of known volcanic activity or cosmic events. The Tambora eruption of 1815, which affected global climate for years, was preceded by reports from Indonesian cultures of days when the air grew thin and breathing became difficult, even for healthy individuals. The Tunguska event of 1908, while primarily known for its explosive destruction of Siberian forest, was also associated with reports from indigenous peoples of brief periods when fires would not burn normally and the air seemed to lose its strength. These accounts were overshadowed by the more dramatic aspects of the event, but they suggest that cosmic phenomena might occasionally affect atmospheric chemistry in ways we don't fully understand. Modern atmospheric science has identified several mechanisms by which Earth's oxygen levels could be temporarily disrupted. Solar flares might trigger chemical reactions in the upper atmosphere that could affect oxygen concentrations. Certain types of volcanic eruptions might release compounds that could chemically bind with atmospheric oxygen. Even asteroid impacts might create temporary changes in air chemistry through mechanisms that are not yet fully understood. If these ancient accounts preserve memories of real events, they might also contain wisdom about surviving such disruptions. The breathing practices, survival techniques, and environmental observations preserved in traditional cultures could represent humanity's accumulated knowledge about navigating atmospheric crises. The stories all end the same way, with the return of normal breathing, the rekindling of fires, and the gradual restoration of the world to its familiar state. But they also consistently warn that such events could happen again, following cycles that ancient astronomers tried to calculate and predict. Whether these tales represent literal history, symbolic wisdom, or some combination of both, they serve as reminders that our ancestors lived with a constant awareness of atmospheric fragility that modern humans have largely forgotten. In their stories, the air itself is not a given, but a gift that could be withdrawn as easily as it had been granted. If 5 seconds of oxygen absence ever occurred in our modern world, perhaps humanity would finally understand what these ancient stories were trying to tell us, that the breath of life is far more precious and fragile than we dare to imagine, and that survival might depend on wisdom preserved in traditions we have been too quick to dismiss as primitive mythology. When oxygen returns to the world after 5 seconds of absence, the immediate crisis appears to pass. Hearts resume their normal rhythm, lungs fill with life-giving air, and the terror of suffocation fades. But in the complex, interconnected systems that support modern civilization, 5 seconds of disruption triggers consequences that continue to unfold for hours, days, and years afterward. The cascading failures begin almost immediately. Picture a massive container ship in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, its engines restored to life after those 5 seconds of silence. The captain orders full speed ahead, eager to make up for lost time, but the ship as navigation systems have been disrupted by the brief power fluctuations that occurred when backup generators tried to engage during the oxygen absence. GPS coordinates are slightly off. Autopilot systems have reset to default settings, and the sophisticated ballast management computers that keep the vessel stable are running recalibration sequences. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, the ports where this ship is scheduled to dock face their own recovery challenges. Computerized cranes that load and unload containers have shut down and restarted multiple times, losing synchronization with the central scheduling systems that coordinate the intricate dance of global shipping. Even though the immediate crisis has passed, the ripple effects of those 5 seconds will disrupt supply chains for months. Air traffic control centers worldwide face an unprecedented logistics nightmare. Thousands of aircraft that made emergency landings when their engines failed are scattered across airports that were never designed to handle such sudden influxes of unscheduled arrivals. Planes meant to be in Los Angeles sit on runways in Phoenix. Aircraft bound for Tokyo have landed in Seoul. The global ballet of commercial aviation, disrupted in just 5 seconds, will take weeks to restore to normal patterns. But the deeper problems lie in infrastructure that suffered invisible damage during those crucial moments. Buildings that experienced subtle structural stress when oxygen temporarily vanished from their materials now exhibit hairline cracks that weren't present before. These flaws won't cause immediate collapse, but they create weak points that will make structures more vulnerable to earthquakes, high winds, and the normal settling that occurs over time. Insurance companies will spend years trying to understand why certain buildings suddenly show accelerated deterioration. Power grids that shut down during the oxygen absence face cascading restart problems. Electrical systems are designed to come back online in carefully orchestrated sequences, but thousands of generators trying to restart simultaneously create frequency imbalances and power surges that damage sensitive equipment. Rolling blackouts occur not because of fuel shortages, but because the grid cannot handle the chaos of its own recovery. The global financial system, perhaps humanity's most complex creation, discovers vulnerabilities no stress test had ever considered. High-frequency trading algorithms, interrupted mid-calculation when data centers lost power, restart with outdated information, and begin making trades based on market conditions that no longer exist. Stock exchanges around the world face the bizarre challenge of determining which transactions were valid during those 5 seconds and which should be canceled due to the unprecedented circumstances. Agricultural systems reveal their own fragility. Greenhouses that depend on precisely controlled atmospheric conditions suffer crop damage not from the brief oxygen absence itself, but from the temperature and humidity fluctuations that occur when climate control systems shut down and restart. Dairy operations face massive milk spoilage as refrigeration systems cycle off and on unpredictably. Perhaps most challenging are the psychological and social aftereffects. Even though the physical crisis lasted only 5 seconds, the memory of that experience begins to reshape human behavior in ways that continue to reverberate through society. Millions of people develop a heightened awareness of their breathing, checking constantly to ensure that each breath provides the satisfaction their bodies expect. Sales of emergency equipment, generators, battery packs, manual tools surge as people seek to prepare for future disruptions. But this preparedness mindset creates its own problems as supply chains, already disrupted by the initial event, struggle to meet suddenly increased demand for survival equipment. Religious movements emerge, claiming the 5-second absence was either divine warning or cosmic punishment. Scientists find themselves in the unusual position of trying to explain an event that challenges fundamental assumptions about atmospheric stability. Governments face pressure to develop contingency plans for scenarios their emergency management protocols had never considered. Children who experience those 5 seconds develop sleep disturbances and anxiety about breathing that child psychologists struggle to understand and treat. Adults report dreams of suffocation and develop compulsive behaviors around fire safety and air quality monitoring. The brief physical event creates psychological trauma that manifests in ways mental health professionals have never encountered. International relations become strained as nations struggle to coordinate recovery efforts while dealing with their own internal chaos. Trade agreements become meaningless when the transportation systems they depend upon are scattered across the globe in random patterns. Diplomatic meetings are postponed indefinitely as government officials find themselves stranded far from their home countries. The internet, that marvel of distributed resilience, discovers gaps in its redundancy. Social media platforms crash, not from the initial power outages, but from the overwhelming flood of posts, videos, and messages, as billions of people simultaneously try to share their experience and seek information about what happened. Emergency rooms fill with patients suffering from the psychological aftermath of those 5 seconds rather than direct physical injury. Paramedics respond to panic attacks triggered by people who associate any shortness of breath with the memory of air that would unsustain life. Hospitals that were prepared for trauma casualties instead find themselves treating anxiety and fear. Scientific instruments around the world have recorded data during those 5 seconds that challenges everything. Atmospheric scientists thought they knew about air chemistry. Research teams formed to study the readings, but their work is hampered by the fact that many monitoring stations lost power or experienced equipment malfunctions during the event. Environmental systems that evolved over millions of years to maintain delicate balances face disruption from the brief but complete interruption of normal chemical processes. Forest fires that were extinguished during the oxygen absence leave behind partially burned landscapes that are more vulnerable to erosion and flooding. Marine ecosystems struggle with the after-effects of the brief disruption to dissolved oxygen levels. The most profound changes, however, are philosophical and cultural. Humanity has received an unexpected lesson in the fragility of the assumptions that underlie civilization. The reliability of air, the permanence of chemical processes, the stability of the elemental foundations of existence, all revealed as contingent rather than absolute. Art, literature, and music begin to reflect themes of atmospheric vulnerability and the preciousness of breath. Religious traditions that had become metaphorical discover renewed literal relevance. Environmental movements gain unprecedented support as people understand viscerally how dependent human civilization is on invisible chemical processes. 5 seconds of absence, but consequences that echo through decades. A brief interruption in the molecular dance that sustains life, but permanent changes in how humanity understands its place in a universe where even the most fundamental elements of existence are far more fragile than we ever dared to imagine. The world has returned to breathing, but it will never again breathe in quite the same way. Commander Sarah Chun floats 360 kilometers above Earth, her body weightless inside the International Space Station, as it orbits at 17,000 miles per hour. Outside her window, the planet curves away in impossible blue, but Sarah isn't looking at the view. She is conducting a routine EVA extravehicular activity, preparing to exit the station into the vacuum of space where no breath is possible. The ritual is precise, practiced thousands of times in underwater training pools and vacuum chambers on Earth. First, pre-breathing pure oxygen for hours to purge nitrogen from her bloodstream and prevent decompression sickness. Then the careful donning of her spacesuit, each seal and connection checked multiple times, because in space, there is no margin for error with life support systems. What makes Sarah's experience particularly relevant to our story is that she regularly works in an environment where oxygen absence is not a 5-second crisis, but a permanent condition. Space is not merely empty of oxygen, it is empty of everything. No air pressure, no chemical reactions, no cushioning layer of atmosphere between human flesh and the infinite cold of the cosmic void. Yet astronauts have learned not only to survive in this ultimate oxygen-free environment, but to work, think, and even find beauty in it. The preparation for space EVAs reveals just how narrow the margins are for human survival without breathable air. During those hours of pre-breathing pure oxygen, Sarah's body is being prepared for an environment where one mistake, one small leak in her suit, would mean unconsciousness in 15 seconds and death within minutes. But astronauts have also discovered something remarkable about human resilience under extreme conditions. In the vacuum of space, if an accident were to breach a spacesuit, the human body could survive for perhaps 90 seconds before irreversible damage occurred. This is far longer than most people would guess, and it's possible only because of physiological adaptations that most humans never have occasion to discover. The key is not holding your breath, a mistake that would cause lung rupture as internal air expanded in the vacuum. Instead, survival depends on exhaling continuously while hoping rescue can arrive before oxygen starvation causes unconsciousness. The human cardiovascular system can continue circulating already oxygenated blood for over a minute, buying precious time that could mean the difference between life and death. Sarah has trained for scenarios that would make our 5-second oxygen absence seem trivial by comparison. She has practiced emergency procedures for spacesuit failures, life support malfunctions, and situations where she might need to make her way back to the station's airlock while her oxygen supply dwindles toward zero. These training exercises reveal psychological truths about breathing that apply directly to our thought experiment. When humans face the prospect of not being able to breathe, panic becomes the greatest enemy. Astronauts learn meditation techniques, controlled breathing patterns, and mental exercises designed to maintain calm when everything in their biology is screaming alarm about oxygen deprivation. Interestingly, astronauts also report that extended time in space changes their relationship with breathing, even when they reach safely inside pressurized modules. The constant awareness that only a thin barrier separates them from airless death makes every breath feel more consciously precious. Many describe returning to Earth with a heightened appreciation for the simple act of breathing freely without technological life support. The space station itself represents humanity's most sophisticated attempt to create a breathable environment in a place where none exists naturally. The Environmental Control and Life Support System, ECLSS, performs the same function as Earth's entire biosphere, converting carbon dioxide back into oxygen, managing humidity, filtering out contaminants, and maintaining the precise atmospheric mixture that human lungs require. This system has backup systems and backups for the backups, because the consequences of failure are absolute. Yet even with this redundancy, astronauts regularly perform maintenance on equipment that literally keeps them breathing. They replace air filters, repair oxygen generators, and monitor atmospheric composition with an attention to detail that most Earth dwellers reserve for far less critical systems. Perhaps most remarkably, Astronauts have learned to sleep peacefully while floating in a tin can surrounded by vacuum, trusting their lives to machines that create breathable air from electricity and chemistry. This level of technological dependence makes their experience surprisingly relevant to our scenario of brief oxygen absence on Earth. If oxygen were to vanish from Earth's atmosphere for 5 seconds, astronauts aboard the International Space Station would be the only humans unaffected by the crisis. Their breathing would continue normally inside their pressurized habitat, sustained by machinery rather than natural atmospheric processes. From their orbital perspective, they might witness the unprecedented sight of all fires on Earth going out simultaneously, city lights winking out as power grids failed, no aircraft lights visible as planes glided unpowered through dark skies. The irony is profound. In our moment of greatest atmospheric crisis, the safest place for human beings would be in the airless vacuum of space, protected by the very technology we developed to survive where breathing is impossible. Sarah's training has taught her that human survival in oxygen-free environments is primarily a matter of preparation, equipment, and psychological resilience. When she conducts her EVA, floating in her pressurized spacesuit with Earth rotating majestically beneath her, she carries with her all the knowledge humanity has gained about staying alive where life should be impossible. That knowledge might prove invaluable if Earth ever faces its own 5 seconds of atmospheric crisis. The techniques astronauts use to remain calm during oxygen emergencies, the backup systems they depend on when primary life support fails, the mental discipline they develop to function effectively under the ultimate environmental stress. All of these could be lessons for a world temporarily learning what space explorers have always known. In the vast silence of space, where no breath has ever been possible, humans have learned to thrive through preparation, technology, and the kind of courage that trusts life to the thin barrier between human ingenuity and infinite emptiness. Perhaps that experience, more than any earthbound preparation, would prove to be humanity's best training for 5 seconds when our home planet briefly forgot how to sustain the breath of life. The invisible web of Earth's climate system depends on molecular interactions so complex that supercomputers struggle to model them accurately. Every weather pattern, every season, every delicate balance that keeps our planet hospitable to life emerges from the dance between gases that make up our atmosphere. Remove oxygen from this equation, even briefly, and you disrupt processes that have maintained climatic stability for hundreds of millions of years. Oxygen plays roles in climate regulation that extend far beyond simply keeping creatures alive. It is woven into atmospheric chemistry, ocean circulation, and the carbon cycle in ways that most climate scientists spend entire careers trying to understand. In those 5 seconds of absence, systems that evolved over geological timescales would face perturbations they were never designed to handle. Consider the ozone layer, that thin shield of OV molecules floating 20 kilometers above your head. This protective barrier, which absorbs deadly ultraviolet radiation before it can reach Earth's surface, exists only because oxygen molecules are constantly being broken apart and recombined by solar energy in the stratosphere. Without oxygen to create ozone, the ultraviolet radiation that normally gets absorbed would begin penetrating deeper into the atmosphere. The immediate effects would be subtle. 5 seconds isn't long enough for dangerous radiation to significantly impact life at ground level. But the disruption to stratospheric chemistry would continue to ripple outward for days or weeks after oxygen returned. Weather patterns in the upper atmosphere might shift in ways that eventually influence surface temperatures and wind patterns around the globe. Perhaps more significantly, oxygen's absence would interrupt photosynthesis across every green plant on Earth simultaneously. This planetary pause in the process that converts carbon dioxide into breathable air would seem brief in human terms, but its effects would cascade through climate systems in unexpected ways. Picture the Amazon rainforest at the moment oxygen vanishes. 60 billion trees suddenly stop their photosynthetic work of pulling carbon dioxide from the air and releasing oxygen. For 5 seconds, the vast green lung of South America becomes nothing more than a collection of beautiful, non-functional sculptures. The water vapor that these trees normally transpire into the atmosphere, enough to influence weather patterns across half the continent, would decrease slightly as metabolic processes shut down. The Amazon generates approximately half of its own rainfall through this transpiration process. Trees draw water from the soil and release it through their leaves, creating the humid air masses that later fall as rain to nourish the forest. Interrupt this cycle even briefly, and you might trigger changes in local weather patterns that continue long after the trees resume their normal function. Multiply this effect across every forest on Earth: the boreal forests of Canada and Russia, the temperate woodlands of Europe and North America, the tropical forests of Africa and Southeast Asia, and you begin to understand the scale of climate disruption that 5 seconds could initiate. Ocean currents, those massive rivers of water that regulate global temperature by moving heat from the equator toward the poles, depend on precise density differences between water masses. These densities are determined partly by temperature, partly by salt content, and partly by dissolved gases, including oxygen. When oxygen vanished from seawater, even temporarily, it would alter the density of surface waters in ways that could influence current patterns. The Gulf Stream, which keeps Europe warmer than its latitude would otherwise allow, depends on such delicate balance points. Even minor disruptions to its flow could eventually affect weather patterns from Ireland to Iceland. The thermaline circulation, the global oceanic conveyor belt that connects all the world as seas, operates on even more precise parameters. This circulation pattern, which takes centuries to complete one full cycle, could be nudged into slightly different patterns by the brief chemical changes that occurred during oxygen's absence. Perhaps most unpredictably, removing oxygen would interrupt countless chemical reactions that normally occur in both air and sea. The atmosphere is not simply a mixture of gases, but a constantly active chemical laboratory where molecules interact, combine, and break apart in reactions that help regulate temperature, humidity, and the composition of air itself. Nitrogen fixation, the process by which atmospheric nitrogen is converted into forms that plants can use, involves complex chemical pathways that require oxygen as a catalyst. Soil bacteria that perform this essential service would find their metabolism disrupted, potentially affecting plant nutrition and growth for weeks after the oxygen absence. The carbon cycle itself, a fundamental planetary process that moves carbon between atmosphere, oceans, land, and living organisms, would experience disruption at every level. Plants would temporarily stop removing carbon dioxide from the air. Ocean chemistry would shift as dissolved gases changed composition. Even the bacterial decomposition of dead organic matter would be interrupted, altering the rate at which carbon returns to the atmospheric system. Weather prediction, already challenging under normal circumstances, would become nearly impossible in the aftermath of such an event. Computer models that forecast climate depend on understanding how current conditions will evolve according to known physical laws. But those models assume the continuation of chemical processes that had just been interrupted in ways that no climate scientist has ever studied. Meteorologists would find themselves trying to predict the behavior of an atmosphere that had been chemically reset in ways that violated every assumption built into their forecasting systems. The butterfly effect, the idea that small changes can have large consequences in complex systems, would be magnified beyond anything in recorded history. Regional climates around the world depend on vegetation patterns that took millennia to establish. Forests create their own weather through transpiration and heat absorption. Grasslands influence wind patterns through their surface texture and seasonal color changes. Even brief interruptions to plant metabolism could begin to shift these regional patterns in ways that would not become apparent for months or years. The Arctic ice cap, already vulnerable to climate change, might respond to atmospheric disruptions in unpredictable ways. Ice formation and melting depend on precise temperature balances that could be affected by changes in atmospheric chemistry or ocean circulation patterns triggered by oxygen's temporary absence. Desert regions, which exist partly because of specific atmospheric circulation patterns, might experience shifts in weather that could turn marginal lands into either more fertile areas or deeper desert. The Sahara Desert, for instance, influences weather patterns across North Africa and even affects Atlantic storm formation through dust particles it contributes to upper atmospheric circulation. Agricultural regions around the world would face the challenge of understanding how brief atmospheric disruption might affect growing seasons, rainfall patterns, and soil chemistry. Farmers might need to adapt their planting and harvesting schedules based on climate changes that no agricultural tradition had ever anticipated. Most sobering of all, the event would demonstrate just how delicately balanced Earth's climate system really is. We live on a planet where the difference between ice age and greenhouse conditions is measured in just a few degrees of average temperature change. Systems that seem stable and permanent are actually balanced on knife edges that could be disturbed by changes we are only beginning to understand. Those 5 seconds would teach humanity that climate is not a backdrop for life, but an active, fragile system that depends on countless chemical and physical processes continuing without interruption. The air we breathe is not separate from the weather we experience. They are parts of a single, integrated planetary system that could be more vulnerable than we ever imagined. In the aftermath, climate science would never be quite the same. The event would provide data about atmospheric sensitivity that no laboratory experiment could replicate, but it would also introduce uncertainties that might take decades to understand fully. The sky would still be blue when oxygen returned, the seasons would still change, and weather would continue to follow familiar patterns. But climate scientists would carry new knowledge about how thin the margin of stability really is, and how quickly the atmospheric foundation of all terrestrial life could shift from reliability to uncertainty. Dr. Elena Vasquez stares at the ice core sample under her microscope, the ancient air bubbles trapped within its crystalline matrix, telling a story that doesn't match any climate data in the textbooks. The ice was extracted from deep within the Greenland ice sheet, formed during a period roughly 12,000 years ago that should show gradual atmospheric changes as the last ice age ended. Instead, the chemical composition suggests something impossible, a brief but complete absence of oxygen that lasted no more than a few minutes. Her colleagues dismissed the readings as contamination, equipment error, or misinterpretation of the data. After all, there is no known geological mechanism that could remove oxygen from the entire atmosphere temporarily and then restore it. The idea violates everything atmospheric science understands about how gases behave on planetary scales. But Elena keeps finding similar anomalies in ice cores from different periods, different locations, and different research teams. Each time, the same signature. Brief episodes where atmospheric composition suggests oxygen levels drop to near zero before returning to normal with unusual rapidity. The anomalies appear to follow a pattern, occurring roughly every 11,000 to 13,000 years, time frame that corresponds intriguingly with certain astronomical cycles. Could these represent real events that mainstream science has been overlooking? Or are they simply recurring measurement errors caused by unknown factors in ice core analysis? Elena's research leads her to examine other geological evidence for atmospheric disruption. Tree ring data from ancient forests show occasional years when growth patterns suggest severe stress to photosynthesis, not from drought, fire, or disease, but from something that affected the fundamental chemistry of plant metabolism. The dates of these anomalous growth patterns correlate suspiciously well with the ice core irregularities. Deep ocean sediment cores reveal their own mysteries. Marine organisms that depend heavily on dissolved oxygen show periodic population crashes that don't correlate with known extinction events, climate changes, or volcanic activity. These marine die-offs are brief, lasting only a few years, but they occur with remarkable synchronicity across different ocean basins, suggesting a global rather than regional cause. Perhaps most intriguing are the geological formations that some researchers have dubbed instant fossils, deposits where marine and terrestrial organisms appear to have been preserved simultaneously under conditions that suggest rapid environmental change. These formations show characteristics consistent with massive, simultaneous die-offs followed by rapid burial and preservation. The conventional explanation for these formations involves catastrophic events like asteroid impacts or supervolcanic eruptions. But Elena's analysis suggests something different. Brief periods when the chemical environment changed so rapidly that organisms were preserved in whatever state the crisis found them, then buried by sediments as normal conditions returned. Carbon isotope ratios in these formations show anomalies that could be consistent with brief interruptions to global photosynthesis. If plants worldwide stopped converting CO2 to oxygen simultaneously, even for a few minutes, it might leave exactly the kind of chemical signature Elena finds in the geological record. Astronomical evidence adds another layer to the mystery. Certain types of solar activity, magnetic field reversals, unusual sunspot cycles, massive solar flares, occur on timescales that roughly match the pattern of atmospheric anomalies in the ice core data. Could intense solar radiation trigger chemical reactions in Earth's upper atmosphere that might temporarily bind or destroy atmospheric oxygen? The hypothesis seems far-fetched until Elena begins studying reports of similar phenomena from other planetary atmospheres. Mars shows evidence of having lost much of its atmosphere suddenly, though over longer timeframes than she's considering for Earth. Venus's atmosphere underwent dramatic chemical changes that transformed it from potentially habitable to lethally hostile. If atmospheric chemistry can change dramatically on other worlds, why should Earth be immune to similar processes? The presence of life on our planet might actually make atmospheric disruption more likely rather than less, since living systems create chemical cycles that could be vulnerable to disruption from external forces. Elena's most controversial research involves examining human historical records for evidence of atmospheric anomalies. Ancient texts from various cultures describe periods when the air grew thin, fires would not burn properly, and breathing became difficult even for healthy individuals. These accounts were traditionally interpreted as describing high-altitude sickness, plague symptoms, or volcanic gas emissions. But when Elena maps the geographical and temporal distribution of these accounts, she finds patterns that don't match any known natural disasters. Instead, the descriptions cluster around dates that correlate with their ice core anomalies and suggest simultaneous atmospheric disturbance across vast geographical areas. The Maya long count calendar, with its complex cycles spanning thousands of years, includes references to periods when the breath of heaven fails, events that occur on schedules remarkably similar to the pattern Elena finds in geological data. Could these ancient astronomers have been tracking real atmospheric phenomena rather than purely symbolic spiritual concepts? Medieval European chronicles contain scattered reports of days when the air lost its virtue and fires burned with unusual colors or refused to kindle normally. Islamic scholars from the same period describe similar phenomena, using terminology that suggests they understood these events as atmospheric rather than spiritual in nature. Chinese astronomical records, with their meticulous attention to unusual phenomena, include accounts of brief periods when the sky appeared wrong and breathing felt labored across entire regions. These records often correlate with reports of structural damage to buildings and unusual animal behavior, exactly what might be expected if atmospheric chemistry had been temporarily disrupted. The pattern of historical accounts suggests that if these events occurred, they were brief enough that most people survived them, but dramatic enough to leave lasting impressions on human memory. Oral traditions from cultures around the world preserve stories of times when the sky forgot to breathe, tales that were dismissed as mythology until Elena began finding potential scientific evidence for their historical basis. Modern atmospheric monitoring might not be sensitive enough to detect brief oxygen depletion events if they occurred today. Most air quality measurements focus on pollution and seasonal changes, not the sudden appearance and disappearance of fundamental atmospheric components. A 5-second oxygen absence might register only as a brief sensor malfunction rather than a real phenomenon. Satellite data that monitors global atmospheric composition has only existed for a few decades, a tiny fraction of the 11,000-year cycle Elena's data suggests. Even if her hypothesis is correct, the next event might be thousands of years in the future, well beyond the time span of human technological civilization. But Elena's research raises disturbing questions about atmospheric stability that mainstream climate science has largely ignored. If the oxygen concentration in Earth's atmosphere can fluctuate dramatically over short time periods, what other assumptions about atmospheric chemistry might need revision? The implications extend beyond pure science into practical planning for human civilization. If periodic atmospheric disruption is a natural phenomenon, shouldn't emergency preparedness include scenarios for brief but complete failure of the chemical processes that sustain life? Elena's colleagues remain skeptical, arguing that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and that ice core anomalies are more likely explained by technical issues than by previously unknown atmospheric phenomena. The scientific consensus maintains that large-scale atmospheric changes occur only over geological timescales, not in the brief episodes Elena's data suggests. But as she continues her research, Elena accumulates more evidence from more sources, all pointing toward the same unsettling conclusion. Earth's atmosphere might be far less stable than we assume, subject to periodic disruptions that could temporarily make breathing impossible for all life on the planet's surface. If Elena is right, our imagined 5 seconds of oxygen absence wouldn't be unprecedented, but rather part of a natural cycle that has been occurring throughout Earth's history. The next event might be predictable, trackable through astronomical observations and geological monitoring, if anyone were willing to take the possibility seriously. Until then, Elena continues her lonely research, searching through ice and rock and ancient texts for proof that the air we depend on has abandoned us before, and might do so again. Imagine if those 5 seconds had actually occurred, not as a thought experiment or a brief crisis quickly resolved, but as a genuine historical event that humanity survived and then spent generations trying to understand. How would such an experience reshape human civilization? How would the survivors tell the story to their children? And what kind of myths and legends would emerge from the collective trauma of the moment when Earth forgot how to breathe? Picture the world 100 years after the Great Silence, as historians might eventually call it. Children in schools learn about the day their great-great-grandparents witnessed every flame on Earth extinguish. Simultaneously, when the sky turned black at noon, when breathing became impossible for exactly 300 heartbeats. The accounts would vary wildly, distorted by human memory and the natural tendency of stories to grow more dramatic with each telling. Some versions might claim the silence lasted for hours rather than seconds. Others might describe supernatural phenomena, angels descending from the darkened sky, messages from the dead carried on the oxygen-free wind, miraculous healings that occurred when breath returned to the world. But beneath the elaborations and myth-making, certain consistent details would emerge across all cultural retellings. The universal moment when fires died, the strange darkness of daylight skies, the way buildings seemed to sag and soften, the particular quality of silence that came when every engine on Earth stopped at once. Religious movements would inevitably emerge around the event. Some would interpret it as divine punishment for humanity's environmental sins, a brief preview of judgment that should inspire immediate repentance and radical changes in how humans relate to the natural world. Others would see it as a test that humanity passed, proof of divine favor and protection, during the most vulnerable moment in human history. New denominations might form around specific interpretations of what the Great Silence meant. The Church of the Restored Breath could teach that the event proved God's direct involvement in sustaining life moment by moment. The Fellowship of the Dark Sky might develop meditation practices focused on remembering the cosmic darkness that briefly revealed itself when atmospheric scattering ceased. Indigenous spiritual traditions would likely interpret the event through their existing frameworks of cosmic balance and natural reciprocity. Many might see it as Earth itself pausing to rest, a planetary breath that reminded all living things of their fundamental interconnection. The event could become incorporated into seasonal ceremonies and coming-of-age rituals as a teaching about the fragility and preciousness of life. Scientific understanding would advance in directions shaped entirely by the need to explain what had happened. Atmospheric chemistry would become the most prestigious field of research, with massive government funding devoted to understanding how oxygen could vanish temporarily and what signs might predict future occurrences. The International Atmospheric Monitoring Network would deploy sensors everywhere, creating the most comprehensive real-time analysis of air chemistry in history. New branches of physics might emerge from trying to explain the event. If oxygen absence had no conventional scientific explanation, researchers would be forced to consider possibilities currently relegated to theoretical speculation: quantum effects on molecular scales, electromagnetic phenomena that could affect chemical bonds, cosmic influences on planetary atmospheres that mainstream science had never seriously considered. Engineering would be revolutionized by the need to design systems that could function during brief oxygen absence. Emergency breathing apparatus would become as common as fire extinguishers in buildings. Transportation systems would incorporate backup power that didn't depend on combustion. Critical infrastructure would be redesigned with redundancy that could maintain function, even when basic chemistry stopped working normally. The psychological impact on human society would be profound and lasting. Post-silence syndrome would become a recognized medical condition, affecting those who experience the event directly. Symptoms might include chronic anxiety about breathing, compulsive checking of air quality, and hypervigilance about any changes in atmospheric conditions. Children born after the Great Silence would grow up with a fundamentally different relationship to the environment than any previous generation. They would learn from infancy that air is not guaranteed, that the invisible foundation of life can disappear without warning. This knowledge would likely produce a generation more environmentally conscious than any in human history, but also more anxious about factors beyond human control. Art and literature would be transformed by themes exploring atmospheric vulnerability. The Great Silence would become a universal reference point for discussing existential fragility, sudden change, and the preciousness of overlooked necessities. Poetry might develop new forms, specifically designed to be read aloud with conscious attention to breathing patterns. Music could incorporate the memory of absolute silence in compositions that played with the absence of sound as powerfully as its presence. Visual artists might create works that depicted the strange beauty of stars visible in daylight, the eerie darkness of a familiar world suddenly revealed as alien. Urban planning would reflect the new awareness of atmospheric fragility. Cities might be designed with more green spaces to maximize local oxygen production. Building codes could require features that would help people survive brief periods without breathable air. Transportation systems might prioritize methods that don't depend on combustion: electric vehicles, human-powered transit, and magnetic levitation systems. International cooperation would likely increase as nations recognize that atmospheric events affect all of humanity equally. The Global Atmospheric Protection Treaty could become the most important international agreement in history, creating unprecedented levels of scientific collaboration and shared monitoring responsibilities. But the timeline would also fracture in other ways. If different regions of Earth experience the oxygen absence slightly differently, perhaps due to local atmospheric, conditions, or elevation differences, competing narratives might emerge about what exactly had happened. These differences could create lasting political and cultural divisions as societies developed incompatible explanations for their shared trauma. Some regions might claim their survival was due to superior spiritual practices or environmental stewardship. Others might insist that their better technology or emergency preparedness had made the difference. These competing claims could lead to new forms of nationalism based not on ethnicity or geography, but on theories about atmospheric resilience. The event would inevitably reshape human understanding of time itself. The moment when oxygen vanished would become a universal reference point, dividing history into before silence and after silence eras. Annual commemorations might develop elaborate rituals around the precise time the event had occurred, with global moments of conscious breathing and gratitude. Perhaps most significantly, the human relationship with uncertainty would be permanently altered. The Great Silence would stand as proof that the most fundamental assumptions about existence can be violated without warning. This knowledge might make humanity wiser and more humble, but also more anxious and less confident about long-term planning. In this fractured timeline, our 5-second thought experiment would become the defining moment of human history, not because of the immediate damage it caused, but because of how thoroughly it would reshape human consciousness about the fragility of the invisible forces that sustain life. The children of that future world would grow up knowing something their ancestors never learned, that every breath is a gift that can be withdrawn as easily as it was given, and that survival depends not on strength or intelligence, but on the continuance of cosmic processes far beyond human control or understanding. In the Orion Nebula, 1,400 light years from Earth, new stars are being born in clouds of dust and gas that glow with the light of stellar nurseries. The raw materials of these stellar infants include oxygen forged in the nuclear hearts of massive stars that lived, earned, and died billions of years before our sun even existed. The atoms that will one day fill human lungs are scattered through this cosmic maternity ward, waiting to be swept up in the formation of planets not yet imagined. This is the deepest truth about the oxygen in your body. It is starlight made solid, nuclear fire transformed into the breath of life. Every oxygen atom currently circulating in your bloodstream was created when a star at least 8 times more massive than our sun reached the end of its fuel supplies and began the cascade of nuclear fusion that produces heavy elements. In the final moments of that stellar life, temperatures reached over 2 billion degrees, hot enough to fuse silicon nuclei together, creating oxygen, neon, magnesium, and iron in a process that lasted mere minutes, but forever changed the chemical composition of the galaxy. When that ancient star exhausted its fuel and could no longer maintain the nuclear fires that held gravity at bay, it collapsed and then exploded in a supernova so brilliant it would have outshone entire galaxies. The explosions scattered the star's oxygen-rich core across light years of space, seeding the interstellar medium with the elements necessary for rocky planets and living things. From this cosmic perspective, the temporary loss of oxygen we're imagining becomes something more profound than biological catastrophe. It would be a momentary disconnection from our stellar ancestry, a brief severing of the atomic bonds that linked human consciousness to the nuclear furnaces where consciousness became possible. Consider the journey those oxygen atoms made to reach your lungs. After being forged in stellar fire and scattered by stellar death, they drifted through the galaxy for perhaps 1 billion years, part of the vast clouds of gas and dust that fill the space between stars. Eventually, they encountered a gravitational disturbance, perhaps the shock wave from another supernova, or the passage of our solar system's formation through the spiral arm of the Milky Way. The gravitational collapse that created our sun and planets swept up that ancient stellar debris, concentrating oxygen atoms that had been wandering through space into the rocky material. That would become Earth. The oxygen in your body has been part of our planet for 4.5 billion years, cycling through rocks, oceans, atmosphere, and countless living creatures before finally reaching you. This means the oxygen molecules you inhale with each breath are immigrants from distant stars, temporary visitors that will spend perhaps 30 seconds in your body before returning to the atmosphere to continue their cosmic journey. The oxygen you exhale might be breathed by a tree, absorbed by ocean water, or incorporated into the rocks beneath your feet, only to be released again by geological processes and continue its endless circulation through the Earth system. But the story extends even further back in cosmic time. The first generation of stars that formed after the Big Bang contained only hydrogen and helium, the lightest elements created in the universe's first few minutes. These primordial suns could never produce oxygen through nuclear fusion. They lacked the heavy elements necessary to sustain the complex fusion processes that create elements heavier than carbon. Only after the first generation of massive stars lived and died, scattering their fusion products through space, could second-generation stars form with enough heavy elements to continue the nuclear alchemy that produces oxygen. Our Sun is probably a third or fourth-generation star, formed from material that has been processed through multiple cycles of stellar death and rebirth. This cosmic recycling means that the oxygen atoms in your body are veterans of multiple stellar explosions. They may have been created in one star, scattered by its death, incorporated into another star system, released again by planetary collision or atmospheric loss, and wandered through space for eons before finally settling into Earth's biosphere. The scale of this stellar heritage is breathtaking. Astronomers estimate that a typical oxygen atom in your body has traveled hundreds of thousands of light years through the galaxy, spending more time drifting between stars than incorporated into planets or living creatures. The atoms that power your metabolism are far more cosmopolitan than most human beings, having visited multiple star systems and witnessed the birth and death of countless worlds. From this perspective, losing oxygen for 5 seconds would represent something unprecedented in cosmic history. The temporary return of processed stellar material to a state resembling the primordial universe when oxygen did not exist. Unaware and nuclear fusion had not yet learned to create the elements of life. The timing of oxygen's appearance in the universe tells its own remarkable story. For the first few 100 million years after the Big Bang, no oxygen existed anywhere in the cosmos. The universe was composed entirely of hydrogen, helium, and trace amounts of lithium, too simple to support the complex chemistry that makes planets and living things possible. Only when the first massive stars began to die did oxygen enter the cosmic story. These stellar pioneers lived fast and died young, burning through their nuclear fuel in just a few million years before exploding and enriching space with heavy elements. The universe's transition from simplicity to complexity began with these early supernovae, each one adding more oxygen and other heavy elements to the gradually enriching interstellar medium. Earth exists during a golden age of cosmic chemistry, when stellar death and birth have achieved a perfect balance that maintains steady oxygen production while avoiding the deadly radiation that would accompany too many supernovae. We live in what astronomers call the galactic habitable zone, a region of the Milky Way that has been enriched by enough stellar deaths to provide heavy elements, but not so many that lethal radiation makes life impossible. This cosmic context suggests that oxygen abundance is not a permanent feature of the universe, but a temporary phenomenon, dependent on the ongoing cycle of stellar death and birth. As the galaxy ages and uses up its supply of hydrogen fuel, fewer stars will form, and the production of new oxygen will decline. Eventually, billions of years in the future, stellar oxygen production will cease entirely, and the universe will begin a slow return to the hydrogen-helium simplicity of its youth. The oxygen that sustains our lives today is part of a brief flowering of cosmic complexity, a window of time, when the universe contains enough heavy elements to support consciousness, but still retains enough stellar fuel to continue producing them. We exist during the universe's mature period, when the first generation of stellar death has enriched space with heavy elements. But the final generation of stellar birth still lies far in the future. In those 5 seconds of oxygen absence, perhaps some deep part of human consciousness would remember this cosmic heritage. Perhaps our cells, temporarily deprived of their stellar inheritance, would experience a kind of homesickness for the nuclear fires where they were born. The elements that compose our bodies would briefly return to something resembling their pre-stellar state, disconnected from the fusion processes that created them and gave them the properties necessary for life. When oxygen returned, flooding back into our lungs and our world, it would carry with it the accumulated memory of every star that died to make human consciousness possible. Each breath would become a prayer of gratitude to stellar ancestors we will never know, and each exhalation would release atoms that might someday travel to other star systems and support other forms of life we cannot imagine. We are the universe becoming aware of itself, powered by the accumulated deaths of countless stellar generations. The air we breathe is not separate from the cosmos, but woven into its deepest fabric, a temporary concentration of stellar ashes that makes consciousness possible for this brief moment in cosmic time. Those 5 seconds would remind us that we are not observers of the universe, but participants in its ongoing evolution, breathing the transformed light of ancient suns and exhaling the raw materials for future worlds. In losing our connection to stellar oxygen, we would understand finally what it means to be children of the stars, and how fragile is the chemical bridge that connects human awareness to the cosmic processes that created it. Maria floats 30 meters beneath the surface of the Caribbean Sea, her breathing regulated by years of training that have taught her to extract maximum efficiency from every breath of compressed air. The reef around her pulses with life. Angelfish drift past in lazy spirals a green moray. Eel slides between coral formations, like liquid shadow, and somewhere in the blue distance, a massive form of a whale shark moves with prehistoric grace. She checks her air gauge automatically. 12 minutes of breathing gas remaining, plenty for a safe ascent with conservative decompression stops. The sun above creates cathedral shafts of light that penetrate the clear water, illuminating an underwater world that feels more like home than the surface ever has. Maria has made over 3,000 dives in her career as a marine biologist, but the magic of breathing underwater still fills her with wonder. At the moment oxygen vanishes from Earth's atmosphere, Maria is examining a section of coral that shows unusual bleaching patterns. Her scientific training has taught her to notice details that most divers miss, so she immediately recognizes that something has changed in the water around her. The first sign is the behavior of the fish. Normally, reef fish maintain predictable patterns. Territorial fish defending their small patches of coral, schooling fish moving in coordinated waves, predators patrolling established routes. Suddenly, every fish in sight begins moving erratically, as if the water itself has become alien to them. Maria watches a parrotfish that had been contentedly grazing on algae suddenly dart upward toward the surface, its movements jerky and desperate. A school of blue tangs that moments before had been feeding peacefully now scatters in all directions, their synchronized swimming replaced by what looks almost like panic. Then she notices something impossible. The bubbles from her regulator are behaving strangely. Normally, exhaled air rises in steady streams toward the surface, but now her bubbles seem to shimmer differently, as if the gas inside them has lost some essential property. The steady rhythm of her breathing hasn't changed, but something about the quality of the air reaching her lungs feels subtly wrong. Maria's scientific mind immediately begins cataloging the anomaly. The dissolved oxygen in seawater around her appears to be changing in ways she's never observed. Her dive computer, which monitors not just depth and time, but also environmental conditions, begins displaying readings that make no sense. Dissolved oxygen levels are dropping rapidly, not gradually as they would during algal blooms or pollution events, but precipitously, as if the water is being chemically transformed. She takes a breath from her regulator and realizes with growing alarm that the air, while still flowing normally from her tank, no longer provides the satisfaction her body expects. It's like trying to breathe at extreme altitude, except she's underwater at a comfortable depth where she should feel no respiratory stress whatsoever. The reef around her begins to change in ways that violate everything she understands about marine ecosystems. Coral polyps, which normally extend to feed on microscopic organisms drifting in the current, suddenly retract completely, as if the water has become toxic. The cleaning stations where small fish normally gather to remove parasites from larger ones empty instantly. The symbiotic relationships that define reef life disrupted by the changing chemistry of their environment. Maria's 15 years of diving experience have taught her to recognize emergency situations quickly and respond with calculated calm rather than panic. But this situation has no precedent in any training manual. Her air supply is functioning normally. Her equipment shows no malfunctions. Yet the fundamental chemistry of breathing, both for her and for every marine creature around her, seems to be failing simultaneously. She checks her depth gauge, 28 meters. A direct descent to the surface would require decompression stops to prevent nitrogen narcosis. But the changing conditions around her suggest that normal dive protocols may no longer apply. If the oxygen in her tank is somehow being affected by the same phenomenon disrupting the marine environment, she may need to reach the surface immediately, regardless of decompression requirements. The whale shark she had glimpsed in the distance now appears in full view, but its behavior is unlike anything she's ever witnessed in 20 years of marine research. The massive creature, normally calm and graceful, is moving erratically toward the surface, its gills working in rapid, labored patterns that suggest respiratory distress. If a whale shark, one of the most efficient filter feeders in the ocean, is struggling to extract oxygen from the water, then the chemical disruption is more severe than she initially realized. Maria makes the decision to begin an emergency ascent, but as she reaches for her buoyancy compensator to begin rising, she notices something that stops her completely. The water around her is changing color. The brilliant tropical blue that makes Caribbean diving so spectacular is shifting toward black, as if the very molecules that scatter sunlight are disappearing from the sea. Looking upward toward the surface, she sees something impossible. The boundary between water and air, normally visible as a shimmering interface where light refracts differently, appears to have changed. The water surface looks like obsidian glass against a sky that has turned completely black, pierced by points of light that should not be visible in daylight. In that moment, Maria realizes she is witnessing something beyond the scope of normal natural phenomena. The disruption affecting marine life, her breathing apparatus, and apparently the atmosphere itself suggests an event of unprecedented scale. She is perhaps the only human being on Earth experiencing this crisis from the perspective of someone already dependent on technological life support. Her scientific training battles with survival instinct as she tries to process the implications. If the surface world is experiencing the same atmospheric disruption that's affecting her underwater environment, then reaching the surface may not provide relief. She might be safer underwater, breathing from her tank's stored air supply, than surface swimmers trying to breathe from an atmosphere that has lost its essential properties. But her air gauge shows only 10 minutes remaining, and that calculation assumes normal breathing rates. If she begins to panic, or if her body's oxygen demands increase due to whatever is affecting the surrounding environment, her breathing gas could be exhausted much more quickly. 5 seconds. From Maria's perspective underwater, time stretches with the peculiar elasticity that divers learn to recognize in emergency situations. Each heartbeat becomes distinct, each breath a conscious decision rather than an automatic reflex. She has trained for equipment failures, for getting lost in underwater caves, for encountering dangerous marine life, but never for the possibility that the fundamental chemistry of existence might simply stop working. The green moray eel she had been observing slides out of its hiding place in the coral. But instead of its usual serpentine grace, its movements seem labored and desperate. Even apex predators, creatures perfectly adapted to their underwater environment, are struggling with conditions their evolution never prepared them for. As suddenly as it began, the crisis passes. The water around Maria seems to shimmer and resettle, returning to its normal brilliant blue. Fish that had been behaving erratically suddenly resumed their normal patterns. Her regulator begins delivering air that once again provides the full respiratory satisfaction she expects. But Maria's scientific mind is already racing ahead to the implications of what she has just witnessed. She has experienced something that may have no precedent in recorded history: a simultaneous disruption of atmospheric and oceanic chemistry that affected every form of life she could observe. Her underwater perspective has given her unique data about an event that surface observers might dismiss or misinterpret. She begins her ascent according to proper decompression protocols, but her mind is already focused on the report she will need to write, the data she will need to analyze, and the questions she will need to ask about what it means when the ocean itself seems to forget even briefly how to support life. From 30 meters underwater, Maria has witnessed the moment when Earth held its breath, and she carries with her the memory of how fragile the boundary between life and void really is, even in the depths of the sea where life first learned to breathe. The Global Atmospheric Emergency Protocol sits in a reinforced vault beneath Geneva, a document that didn't exist before the first 5-second absence, but now represents humanity's most carefully guarded contingency plan. Written in the aftermath of what historians call the Great Silence, this protocol outlines humanity's strategy for surviving a second atmospheric crisis based on hard-won knowledge from the first. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, director of the International Atmospheric Monitoring Consortium, reviews the latest data from sensors that now monitor air chemistry with unprecedented precision at over 10,000 locations worldwide. The monitoring network established after the first event can detect changes in atmospheric composition measured in parts per billion, sensitivity that would have seemed like science fiction before humanity learned how quickly invisible foundation of life can shift. If it happens again, Dr. Tanaka tells her assembled team, we, LL, have approximately 47 seconds of warning based on the precursor chemical changes we've identified in the archived data from the first event. 47 seconds. Less than a minute to initiate emergency protocols that could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe for billions of people. The warning systems are now hardwired into every critical infrastructure network on Earth: power plants, hospitals, air traffic control centers, emergency services. When the atmospheric sensors detect the specific chemical signature that precedes oxygen depletion, automated systems will trigger responses designed to minimize casualties. Emergency oxygen supplies are now mandatory in all public buildings, workplaces, and transportation systems. The technology has advanced dramatically since the first event, driven by the understanding that humanity might face this crisis again. Portable oxygen concentrators that can function for hours on battery power are as common as fire extinguishers. Every school has breathing apparatus sized for children. Every airplane carries emergency oxygen systems redesigned based on the knowledge that engine failure due to oxygen absence requires different survival strategies than traditional aviation emergencies. But perhaps the most significant changes are psychological and social. The generation that lived through the first event, now called silent survivors, has taught their children and grandchildren to live with conscious awareness of atmospheric fragility. Breathing exercises are part of standard education, not just for health, but for emergency preparedness. Children learn to recognize the early signs of oxygen deprivation and practice techniques for maintaining consciousness during brief periods of inadequate air supply. The Global Emergency Response Architecture represents the largest international cooperation project in human history. When atmospheric sensors detect the pre-depletion signature, automated systems will shut down all non-essential combustion processes worldwide, reducing oxygen demand during the critical period. Traffic lights will immediately shift to patterns that bring all vehicles to safe stops. Industrial furnaces will initiate emergency cooling sequences. Power grids will switch to renewable-only generation modes that don't require combustion. Hospitals have been redesigned around the possibility of brief oxygen absence. Every patient receives continuous monitoring that can instantly detect changes in blood oxygen levels. Emergency ventilators that function on stored compressed air rather than ambient atmosphere are stationed throughout medical facilities. Surgical procedures are planned with contingencies for sudden interruption of normal breathing support. The agricultural implications have reshaped global food security strategies. Hydroponic and aeroponic systems that can maintain plants during brief atmospheric disruption are now prioritized for essential crop production. Seed banks maintain varieties specifically selected for rapid recovery from temporary photosynthesis interruption. Livestock are housed in facilities with emergency life support systems that can sustain animal populations through short-term oxygen absence. Urban planning has been revolutionized by the understanding that atmospheric events affect all of humanity equally. Cities now incorporate design features that would help populations survive brief periods without breathable air. Public spaces with emergency air supplies, transportation systems that don't depend entirely on combustion, and communication networks that can function when traditional power grids fail. The most sophisticated preparations are technological. Research teams have developed atmospheric restoration systems that could theoretically accelerate the return of oxygen if natural restoration processes were somehow delayed. These systems, positioned strategically around the globe, use advanced chemistry to rapidly convert stored compounds into breathable air, insurance against the possibility that a second event might last longer than the first. But perhaps the most remarkable development is in human adaptation itself. Meditation and breathing practices that were once considered fringe interests have become mainstream survival skills. Millions of people have trained in techniques that can extend consciousness during oxygen deprivation, maintain calm during respiratory crisis, and coordinate group survival during atmospheric emergencies. Professional silence wardens, individuals trained in emergency atmospheric response, are now stationed in every community. These specialists understand the physiological and psychological effects of oxygen deprivation and can guide groups of people through crisis periods using techniques developed by studying survivors from the first event. The economic implications have created entirely new industries. Atmospheric insurance is now a major sector of the financial world, with policies covering everything from business interruption due to breathing emergencies to medical treatment for atmospheric crisis survivors. Emergency equipment manufacturing has become one of the fastest-growing sectors of the global economy. International law has been transformed by the recognition that atmospheric events represent existential threats requiring unprecedented cooperation. The Atmospheric Emergency Convention gives international authorities the power to override national sovereignty during crisis periods, ensuring that response efforts aren't hindered by political boundaries or jurisdictional disputes. Yet despite all this preparation, scientists acknowledge that humanity's survival of a second event would still depend largely on the specific characteristics of that crisis. If oxygen absence lasted significantly longer than 5 seconds, or if the warning period were shorter than the 47 seconds current systems assume, even the most sophisticated preparations might prove inadequate. Dr. Tanaka's team continues refining their predictive models, trying to understand whether the atmospheric conditions that led to the first event are cyclical, random, or part of some larger cosmic pattern. Their work suggests that if a second event occurs, it might not be identical to the first, possibly lasting longer, affecting broader geographical areas, or involving different atmospheric chemistry changes. The psychological preparations may ultimately prove as important as the technological ones. Humanity has learned to live with the knowledge that breathable air is not guaranteed, that the atmosphere can fail without warning, and that survival depends on both individual preparation and collective cooperation. This knowledge has made human civilization more resilient, but also more anxious, more environmentally conscious, but also more aware of forces beyond human control. Children born after the first event grow up with a fundamentally different relationship to the environment than any previous generation. They understand viscerally that oxygen is not unlimited, that technology depends on chemical processes that can be interrupted, and that survival sometimes requires skills their parents never thought they would need. If a second atmospheric crisis occurs, humanity will face it not as a surprise, but as a challenge they have spent decades preparing for. The question is whether preparation based on one 5-second event can adequately address the possibility that a second event might follow different patterns, last longer, or involve complications that the first experience didn't reveal. The monitoring systems continue their vigilant watch, analyzing atmospheric chemistry in real time and searching for the subtle changes that might herald another period when Earth forgets how to sustain the breath of life. In control rooms around the world, specialists trained in atmospheric crisis management maintain their readiness to implement protocols that represent humanity's best guess about how to survive when the invisible foundation of existence proves once again to be more fragile than we ever imagined. The question is not whether humanity could survive a second time, but whether we have learned the right lessons from the first time, and whether the universe will give us credit for our preparation when it tests us again. The world has always understood breath as more than air. It is rhythm. It is life. It is the invisible thread that binds the body to the soul. In the deserts of Egypt, priests once whispered that the god Re exhaled the morning sun. Each dawn was not just light, but the breath of a divine being made visible. To breathe was to share in the same essence as the gods themselves. Across the ocean, in the temples of India, sages spoke of prana. It was not just oxygen, but the cosmic life force flowing through all living things. When breath moved, the universe moved. When it stopped, creation trembled. The Greeks named it pneuma. Philosophers described it as the animating principle of existence. Not a mere gas, but the sacred spark hidden within every chest. And in China, the ancient masters spoke of qi, the energy of the world, carried on the inhale and the exhale. They believed the balance of empires, the flow of rivers, and the fate of dynasties depended on the harmony of this unseen breath. Meanwhile, among the first peoples of the Americas, breath was woven into story. In the Navajo creation tale, life began when the holy people gave the first humans the power of wind within their nostrils. Without that gift, the body was nothing but clay. Across cultures, across centuries, the pattern repeats. Breath is not only survival, it is memory, it is faith. It is the very threshold between flesh and spirit. Now, imagine those 5 seconds again, not through the lens of science, but through the eyes of a believer. When the air disappeared, it was not only oxygen that left, it was spirit. It was divinity itself, stepping away for an instant. What would it mean for the world's religions if the sacred breath failed? Would temples fall silent? Would people see it as punishment? Or would they see it as proof that their ancestors were right all along? Perhaps the gods had returned to claim what was theirs. Perhaps the universe had withdrawn its energy, reminding us of our fragility. Odd facts emerge here too. During the Black Death, chroniclers wrote of entire villages suffocated by a bad air that swept through the valleys. They did not know disease. They believed the spirit of air itself had turned against them. Centuries later, in Victorian London, when smog swallowed the streets, the people called it the breath of death. Every inhale felt like betrayal. Every cough like a warning that the sacred force was being poisoned. Breath is survival, but it is also story. Without it, we are not only lifeless. We are meaningless. And so, the 5-second silence becomes more than a collapse of science. It becomes a collapse of faith. If breath vanishes, even for moments, humanity is forced to question, is life only chemistry, or something greater? Time is strange. 5 seconds is almost nothing. A blink, a pause in conversation, the space between heartbeats. But when those seconds hold catastrophe, they stretch into eternity. For pilots whose aircraft fell from the sky, those 5 seconds never ended. For divers whose lungs collapsed beneath the waves, the moment lasted a lifetime. For families who watched buildings crumble into dust, the memory carved itself into stone. Even as oxygen returned, humanity was changed. Because catastrophe does not vanish when the danger is over. It lingers. It writes itself into the fabric of memory. Think of Krakatoa. The volcanic eruption lasted hours, but its echo circled the earth for years. Think of Chernobyl. The meltdown lasted moments, but generations are still marked by it. So too with oxygen's absence. The silence may last only 5 seconds, but its shadow falls across centuries. Stories would be told. At first, scientific reports, charts and diagrams, explanations of collapsed lungs, extinguished fires, and the sky turned black. But soon, myths would grow. Children would hear of the day the world stopped breathing. Poets would call it the silent hour. Religions might weave it into prophecy. Governments would build monuments to remind future generations of the fragility of life. Civilization would adapt. New technologies would emerge to guard against the unthinkable. Oxygen vaults buried deep underground. Cities designed with sealed domes. Masks made not just for pollution, but for the memory of the day when air betrayed us. Meanwhile, artists would struggle with the paradox. How can something so brief last forever? How can a moment smaller than memory shape the destiny of humanity? Perhaps because time is not measured by length, but by weight. A single second of loss weighs more than 1,000 years of safety. A single pause in breath can define what it means to live. Oddly enough, even science would begin to remember differently. Historians would mark calendars by it. Before the silence, after the silence. Geologists might carve it into their records as a new epoch of Earth's story. And as centuries pass, the tale would blur. Some would doubt it ever happened. Others would worship it as truth. But all would feel its shadow, stretching through time. Because 5 seconds is not always 5 seconds. Sometimes it is forever. In the end, the question is not what happened in those 5 seconds. The question is what they meant. Oxygen has always been fragile. It is borrowed from the stars gifted to us by ancient supernova, carried on winds older than Earth itself. It does not belong to us. It was never promised to last. One day, it could be taken back, not by disaster, but by time. Planets change, stars fade, worlds die. What if this was only a warning? What if the universe was reminding us of our place, that life is a privilege, not a guarantee? Civilization would move forward, as it always does. But somewhere, in the silence between breaths, the memory remains. The memory of fragility. The memory of dependence on something invisible, untouchable, yet absolute. Breath is more than air. It is connection. It is the reminder that life itself is borrowed. And so we return to silence. The same silence that covered the world when oxygen left. The silence before the first inhale of life. And the silence that will remain long after the last. Perhaps that is the real question. Not what if oxygen left for 5 seconds, but what if it leaves forever? If you enjoyed this journey, consider subscribing. There are many more mysteries to uncover, waiting in the silence between worlds.